So I'm curious, when you heard Leo XIV, what was the first couple things that went through your mind?
Habemus Papam.
He didn't pick any names that were previously used in the 20th century or the 21st. So he didn't pick Francis II, he didn't pick John Paul III. He doesn't identify himself with having to continue in an explicit way the legacy of any of those men. While he is someone who was close to Francis and worked with him, he doesn't want to necessarily have his pontificate viewed simply as a continuation of what Pope Francis did.
Amoris Laetitia, help us understand what he was doing.
The Pope said in the footnote that in some circumstances, communion can be given to those who are in irregular situations, couples in irregular situations, which is a euphemism for people in adulterous second marriages. This is very bad. This is very bad. Amoris Laetitia needs to be withdrawn because it offends Catholic moral teaching. Cardinals who had problems with it wrote to the Pope and asked for clarification.
Cardinal Burke.
Cardinal Burke was one of them. He would not answer. You have a Pope who is a man who's exercised authority in the Church up to this point. He's certainly educated. He knows canon law. So it'll be very good if cardinals now say, well, now we have a series of questions, things we've discussed here, Amoris Laetitia, Fiducia Supplicans, death penalty. Doubts are expressed about the nature and validity of these teachings and practices. Could we please get some clarity? I think that Pope Leo will be much more inclined to do so.
Father Gerald Murray, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. Finally to meet you in person. It's a real honor.
Thank you, Conor. Great to be with you.
You have probably don't need much of an introduction to our listeners, but let me just kind of hit some of the highlights, if you don't mind. So for those who don't know, can know what a prestigious guest we really have today. I mean, you have been an incredible voice of clarity, wisdom, insight, for the Church for many, many years now, on TV, radio, articles, and now in podcasts. That's why I really wanted to have you here. And there's very few voices that we can always, whenever we see the name, we say, oh, well, Father Gerald Murray said it. It's like an unofficial authority within the Church, I guess. And so, at least in the circles I run in. So it's a really great pleasure to have you here. You graduated from Dartmouth College, Seminary, Dunwoody in 1980. By the way, was Father Groeschel there at that time?
Father Groeschel taught me at Dunwoody.
Did he really? Yeah,
he was
okay.
one of the professors, yes.
Oh, man, I bet you that was a special thing because I love that man. I really did.
Good man, yes.
Yeah. You went to the Greg, or the Gregorian University in Rome. You got your doctorate in canon law, which is so desperately needed in the time of chaos and craziness that's been happening in the Church for 15 years or so. So it's great to always have a canonist's explanation of things. Currently, you serve as the pastor of St. Joseph's Church in Manhattan, and you have written countless articles. Here it is. Here's some of them right here. It's in depth on every subject, seemingly. So it's great to have great insight into so many of the problematic issues that laymen like me have just been grappling with for over a decade. And you're also the author of an excellent book, Calming the Storm, published with Emmaus Road, co-authored with Diane Montagna, who's also great. I mean, she's over there in Rome doing incredible work. So you've been on EWTN, Fox News, Fox Business, Radio, Ave Maria Radio, Relevant Radio. You're fluent in French, Spanish, Italian. You have working knowledge of Portuguese. Whenever somebody has working knowledge, that means they're basically fluent. And you served in the U.S. Naval Reserve's Chaplain Corps from 1994 to 2005. So thank you for your service.
Thank you.
I mean, the resume is incredible. And so with all of that, again, it's an honor to welcome you to this table.
No, it's great to be with you and look forward to our conversation.
So I thought, you've been through, a crazy couple weeks here after the papal election. I mean, it's been a wild ride. How long has it been now? I mean,
getting for almost 4 weeks
okay,
since
a
the
month
Pope was elected.
Okay,
yes.
okay. And so this will probably come out in a couple weeks. I don't know, Kevin, if we've really chosen a time, but we'll probably want to release this sooner than we usually would. And we usually record these things, a good bit before we release them. But given the timeliness of this, we're probably going to have to bend the schedule a little bit to get this in quicker. So that gives people an idea of like when I thought the timeliness of it kind of was important for them to know. But I thought, Father, what I'd do is kind of tell you and the listeners a little bit of a roadmap of today's conversation. And so first, I'm going to begin with just getting your thoughts on the new Holy Father and the conclave and what your impressions are. And then I'm going to ask you some very specific questions about what you think he's going to do, very specific things in regards to some specific people. You might not have answers to that, but we'll dive into that. But then the heart of our conversation is really going to be 3 to 4 subjects. The first is the tradition and the sacred liturgy. You've written extensively on that, particularly the Pope's tradition, the previous Holy Fathers, Pope Francis's Traditionis, Custodes. Then we're going to talk about the Church's response to homosexuality and transgenderism, particularly in regards to the document Fiducia Supplicans. And then we're going to also talk about synodality, because I'm confused along with everyone else what the hell that is. And then we're going to, if we have time, we'll get to some of the legacy issues, kind of where things stand with the McCarrick scandal and the broader questions of accountability and kind of what the Church has to do going forward. So this is a full plate, and so we'll see what we get through. And if it's only the first, it's fine. So with all of that preface, let me just hand it over to you. Tell me about the conclave and how Leo got elected. I mean, you're pretty plugged in. How do you answer that? I'm sure you've been asked 100 times in the last month.
Well, it's interesting. I was over there for 2 weeks leading up to and then immediately following the election of Pope Leo. And I didn't think an American had a chance to get elected Pope, and that was the common wisdom among pundits and analysts. But a few days before, maybe 4 or 5 days even, before the election, Cardinal Prevost's name came up, and people were pushing him as being a good candidate. I didn't know much about him. I remember hearing that the Pope had taken the bishop from Peru, who was an American, and made him the head of the dicastery for bishops, which is the department that names new bishops or recommends names to the Pope for his approval. And I thought, okay, I remember that happening. He's a religious order man. Pope Francis liked to name fellow religious order members to important roles in the Vatican. But I never thought of him as being papabile, as they say, someone who's likely to become a pope. That all changed, of course, on Thursday, the 8th of May, when he came out on the balcony. Why did it happen? In my analysis or kind of reflection and reading what other people have said and thinking about it, there are a few factors. One is he was someone close to Pope Francis for the last 2 years of Pope Francis's life. And the Pope liked him and put him in an important role. So he had papal favor. And I think that counted among the vast majority of the cardinals were named by Pope Francis. So the fact that he was someone associated with Pope Francis was, in their opinion, a source of endorsement for him. Secondly, he is someone who did have contact with many cardinals through being head of this bishops' or a conference, a bishops' dicastery, as it's called now. So therefore, he would have had, FaceTime, as they call it, with people, and they could see he's a calm, reflective man, that he's someone who certainly can speak and has spoken eloquently, and you can go back and look at old videos, but he's got a calming personality, and I think that's a factor that plays into it. He's a knowledgeable man, religious order man. He's a canon lawyer, so therefore he has, let's say, the kind of basic knowledge you need for managing the church. If you're not a canon lawyer, you need to get a good one to help you. And then another factor I think that plays into it is that he was American, but not very American. So he's the least American of the American cardinals, because he is from Chicago, baseball fan, tennis player, but spent most of his adult life outside of the United States. He was head of his order, the Augustinians, for 11 years in Rome. He was a missionary prior to that in Peru, and then he went back. Pope Francis named him the Archbishop of Chiclayo, a northern diocese in Peru. So he really is a Latin American - North American cardinal who became Pope. So I think a lot of people saw him. He has a lot of positive factors. The Latin American side means that he, people from what we call the third world, the developing nations, will look on him as someone who has experience and knowledge of what they're going through. People look at his North American side, say, well, he's got American know-how and an ability to, Americans are famous for getting things done. So I think that would be another aspect. The money thing is in the background.
Yeah.
The Cardinals had a whole day presentation to them before the conclave saying how bad the Vatican finances are. It's a deficit operation. It's poorly managed personnel and asset-wise. So,
question on that.
Yeah.
So you might not know, but if a business runs in a deficit, cash deficit at least, you have to just go to a bank and get a loan. What does the Vatican do when it runs on a deficit year after year? Does it go get a loan?
I think it takes money from the Vatican Bank or takes loans out. I'm not quite sure of how they do it specifically. The deficit is 30, maybe it was 50 million, 40 to 50 million euros last time. It was a year ago. I don't know how they finance those on an ongoing basis. They have their own bank, so that means they can always, it's cash on hand if they need it. And then they probably, they might anticipate revenues coming in and then be able to, I don't know if they get loans from Italian banks, short-term things. But, the situation there requires, and Pope Francis saw it requires reform, but he wasn't willing to go the whole route with it.
Right.
He put Cardinal Pell in charge. Cardinal Pell was stepping on people's toes in the sense of saying, you got to tell me what you have here in this Vatican department, and it's no longer going to be managed by you, and this and that. And he got lots of resistance to that. In short, it was, even though the Vatican's a centralized operation, it was very decentralized in the way money was managed. And you can't do that anymore. We live in a modern world where financial accountability is part of your credibility as an organization, and plus you just got to pay your expenses. And there are ways now, that investment opportunities that the Holy See should take advantage of, so they can have more resources to pay their bills.
Yeah. I do think that both the left and the right, for lack of a better word, I don't like those words, but whatever, they saw that the Vatican just needed to run more smoothly. I mean, my understanding is that the late Holy Father just aside from his ideology, he just didn't run it well. There was confusion, and so I've wondered if part of this was Pope Leo looks like a good administrator. Things do need to run well on a natural level, not just with money, but with communication. My understanding is the Cardinals had never really communicated. They hadn't known each other. That's a problem. The communication, Pope Francis always saying something off, or did it need clarification? How his messaging from his encyclicals or his plane rides, how this was communicated. Whoever was the head of the communication office of the Vatican should have been fired a long time ago. It's just not well done. So I'm wondering how much of this is just they say, okay, we need somebody who can make the trains run on time better, and that's valid. There's a valid component to that, I guess.
I think you got a good point there. Absolutely, that's not the primary reason you elect the Pope, but it's a factor that goes into analysis of, can this man do it? In general, even though I'm an American, to be accused of being, self-praising, the Anglosphere, meaning, the British Empire and all of its, distant cousins, they have a different attitude toward money and management and employment than does other cultures. And Italy, it's a very paternalistic type of culture as regards money. These go back, in my opinion, to kind of like the way things were run under patronage systems, under monarchies. This sort of national wealth is viewed as something different than the way we look at it in the U.S. The national wealth here, there's no such thing as national wealth. There's individual people have money, and they give part of it to the government under compulsion. Yeah. But, the way you get out of a financial hole is not to use coercion to take money away from people. You figure out, what do I cut my costs and how do I improve my investments? So anyway, that's too specific maybe for this discussion.
Yeah, that's right.
I think certainly that Pope Leo has the promise of being able to bring in a new perspective on the Vatican finances, given that he's only worked there for a couple of years. Therefore, he's not been involved in years and years of seeing how things go and getting used to it. The question is he going to put the personnel in place to do that? Because he can't do that personally. He's got other things to worry about.
Well, I'm going to get to asking a question about his Curia and like what's he going to do there. But first, when I saw him come out and they said Leo the 14th, however they said that in Latin, I kind of was able to get it. I heard Leo. And I was ecstatic instantly because Leo the 13th is one of my favorites. I've taught him a lot in college. And I always like to say, if I was elected Pope, first, I'd be the first one with 16 children. Okay. Secondly, I would either have chosen the name Athanasius or Leo the 14th. And so then Leo the 14th walks out, and I'm kind of blown away with that. But then right away, my brain raced in the different directions. That's a symbol. It means something, and I could see it meaning different things. So I'm curious, when you heard Leo the 14th, what was the first couple things that went through your mind?
Well, I was surprised. I obviously thought this was a tribute to Leo the 13th. Subsequent discussion, which I had with somebody, was he didn't pick any names that were previously used in the 20th century or the 21st. So he didn't pick Francis II. He didn't pick John Paul III. He didn't pick Benedict the 17th. Didn't pick Pius the 13th. So in other words,
Paul the Seventh.
Thank you. Yeah, I left one out.
John the 24th.
Yeah. So in other words, he doesn't identify himself with having to continue in an explicit way the legacy of any of those men, given the historical records of what their pontificates were. That he didn't pick Pope Francis II is an indication that, and we'll talk about this in the podcast, while he is someone who was close to Francis and worked with him, he doesn't want to necessarily have his pontificate viewed simply as a continuation of what Pope Francis did, because otherwise it would have been natural. Like John Paul II took John Paul I, even though he was only there 30 days. Yeah. But the idea was what John Paul II took that name because he wanted to combine John the 23rd and Paul VI. So, and certainly in the Piuses, it was just a good tradition to keep that name, Pius X, 11, 12, 13th.
Well, you can't,
would have been the one.
If you can't get the 13th because it messes up the clock. Have you seen the Pius the 12th clock?
No, I haven't seen that.
We got it in Chris Kona's office. When you walk out right before you leave the building, you'll see all the hours on the clock are one of the Piuses. So there's 12. You can't, maybe 13 could go in the middle, but
Yeah, well, that could be your second monitor.
Right,
yeah.
right. So any indications? I mean, I think right after, like the next day, he talked about AI and automation, and there's another industrial revolution, and that was some level of rationale for Leo the 14th because the 13th dealt with the industrial revolution. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
That's a good point, and he's making a point that the Vatican has been looking at for a couple of years. What's the moral analysis of artificial intelligence and how it's being put to use, and then there are worries because large artificial intelligence, the way I understand it, is largely an efficiency tool. It creates possibility of accomplishing tasks in much quicker and much more precise and more accurate. So that is that's in general that can be used for good things, but also used for evil. It can be it's a much easier way to steal and to destroy and things of that sort. So artificial intelligence is a subject that we're going to learn a lot more about already. It's happening, but the church has to give a moral evaluation of how it's used.
I think, if I could just share my thought on it, ChatGPT, AI, Father, it's in kindergarten right now.
Sure.
And it's going to get a PhD. Okay? That's really what's going on. Like, it's in kindergarten. It's going to get a PhD in like 10 years. It's going to have a PhD. Okay? So it's not going to take 25 years to get it like a normal person. So the automation component of AI is where the workers' rights come into play. there is going to be massive unemployment. Now, it's interesting that as soon as chat came out, what they discovered, Kevin, what's the guy's name who started chat?
Sam Altman.
Yeah, Sam Altman. Yeah, I remember him. Yeah, that's true. But I'm talking about Sam Altman, who talked a lot about chat. They thought initially that AI would kind of deal with blue collar jobs like manufacturing and things. What they were surprised to see is that it does the arts better. Like it's making pictures and writing poetry and editing papers and doing research. It's doing those things initially first. But they're going to get to where there's like one person working in McDonald's and they're managing a bunch of machines, and they're going to be where you go into a manufacturing facility and there's a whole bunch of robots making cars and there's a couple tech guys managing those machines. And, the automation is going to cause massive unemployment, and there's going to be a handful of people that get mega wealthy, which goes back to the whole Leo XIII Industrial Revolution, capitalist versus laborers, where you're going to have the guy in the top hat getting mega wealthy, and you have these drones working in the sweatshops. Back in the 1800s, they were drones working in the sweatshops. Now they're just going to go home. And so they're not going to have work, and you can't think that everyone's going to go get a doctorate in computer science and design code. They're not going to do that. So I think that's what's going to happen with AI, and I think it's going to be during the pontificate of Leo XIV. I'm betting we're going to have an encyclical that is in the tradition of Rerum Novarum, like there was Centesimus Annus by John Paul II, 100th anniversary. We're going to have another one, whatever that anniversary would be. It was 1891 when Rerum Novarum came out. 100 years later, 1991, at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism, he writes Centesimus Annus. We're going to have another one like that, and it's going to talk about the duties of employers to not just willy-nilly cast human beings aside and replace them with artificial intelligence. And it's also going to talk about if people are unemployed, like what do they do with their time? What's the government supposed to do in terms of welfare and helping people survive if like 20% of the populace becomes unemployed? It's like the Great Depression here in the 20s, the most it was ever unemployed was less than 20%. And we could be facing that with automation. So I think the Holy Father, I'm just kind of dumping that over there.
Okay.
I think the Pope could have a major thing that he has to contend with.
Yeah. Well, I'm not as bearish as, thinking that this is all going to be a disaster for employment, because efficiency creates cheaper products. So therefore you have, wider selection. Some people say, oh, that's cold. If you don't have a job, you're not going to buy your Barbie doll at $10 less. But new opportunities come, and there are other things, And I live in New York City. Manufacturing disappeared there a long time ago, largely because of a combination of tax and transportation issues. But we have the thriving service economy, and the richer the country becomes, the more people travel. There are more opportunities to do other things. Certainly, we do have to maintain certain industries. I think the government should favor some things like defense industries and all things that you need in case you're attacked. But I'm not as, for me, efficiency is always a threat, but it's sort of like I flew down here. I did it on Delta on the website. When I was a newly ordained priest, I went to a travel agency, and the woman took out a card and ran a thing over, a copy piece of paper and said, "Here's your ticket." Yeah. That woman is, I'm sure, long retired, but, we're not in a disaster zone because of previous progress. I don't think we'll be in a disaster zone because of future progress, but things will change. And that's one of the reasons why this, one of the greatest contributions the Catholic Church has to give is insisting on universal education and giving it to people. In other words, if government wants to help people to deal with an economy that's less labor intensive, you got to give them an education that's worthy. And that's a disaster in our country in many ways. Thank God for charter schools and competition and the Catholic school system. So it's a large question, but no, undoubtedly we're going to be looking at these issues.
I hope you're right. I hope it's not as bleak as maybe I'm just my melancholic Irish is coming out.
Hey, got to have something to complain about.
Right. All right. So, any early indications of what you think Pope Leo is going to be like? I mean, there you go.
Well, I think stylistically, he's a lot different. He wore the pontifical robes when he came out on the balcony. He seems very comfortable with the idea of moving back into the papal palace, the apostolic palace it's called, which is basically a big building with some rooms for the Pope, but it's got some beautiful public rooms where there's lots of art. I think he'll do that. He may go back to Castel Gandolfo, which is the papal summer residence, about 30 miles outside of Rome.
Did Pope Francis never really go there?
Pope Francis never went there. He refused to go there. He didn't want to do it. Pope Francis didn't take vacations. That's another thing. I hope, Pope Benedict did. John Paul II, not so much, but he liked to do some sports and things.
Skied. He went skiing. Yeah, he disappeared a few times.
Yeah, we found that out later. He snuck out.
I published that book.
Oh,
it's
you
called
did?
The Secret Life of John Paul II. Yeah, he snuck out.
Yeah, hid in the back of the car.
Yeah.
And went skiing with his
awesome.
secretary. No, that's
awesome.
That's a great thing. And if you can afford it, take a vacation. It's just a good idea to step away from your work for a while. But so we'll see if Pope Leo takes a vacation. But going to Castel Gandolfo was a nice relaxer because Rome is very hot and humid, and this is up in the mountain, the Castelli Romani they call it. Anyway, so that's different. Now there have been continuity with Pope Francis things, which for me can be concerning. He talked about a synodal church.
Yeah.
As soon as he came out on the balcony, he's quoted Pope Francis extensively. He's talking about synodality. He's appointed some people, such as the Pontifical Academy for Life,
yes,
who were working with Archbishop Paglia, who turned 80. He's out, but when you're not going to reform an institution that needs reform by putting the existing number 2 in the number 1 slot. So the Lateran University, likewise, that's some questions. So we'll see. All of the heads of the departments were given temporary appointments, because what happens was that the heads of Vatican departments lose their job when the Pope dies, according to canon law. So the new Pope comes in and either puts them back in place permanently, puts them in temporarily, or removes people and puts in new names. Well, this Pope has not put any new heads of any departments at the moment in the Vatican Curia, so we're waiting to see. Now, he put a number 2 at the Congregation for the Dicastery for Religious. He put a religious woman.
Yep.
And I'm very concerned about that, because that's a canonical innovation done under Pope Francis that I find unacceptable. And we can talk about that. But right now, we're waiting to see.
What are the big ones to pay attention to? Secretary of State and the head of CDC? Is that what it would be called? CDF.
The most important job is the number 2 in the Vatican, which is the Secretary of State. Cardinal Parolin has been there for almost the entire pontificate of Pope Francis. So even if you were, someone who was younger, let me back that up. Generally, people who run the CDF, the Secretary of State, they don't retire. They just leave, or they don't go to another department. So he would basically go into retirement, whatever age. And Cardinal Parolin is in his middle 70s, close, I think maybe 72 or 3. So he might retire. The Cardinal Fernandez, who was Pope Francis, he's the CDF, and he was his close ally, ghostwriter.
Yeah.
My opinion, shouldn't be in the job. I don't think he's qualified, and I don't think he's done a good job. So maybe he'll go. We don't know.
I think that's a really important one to watch. I mean, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, right? Now, this is what Ratzinger had, and I think that's when he got well known. And then Cardinal Mueller was in there for a while.
He was there for 5 years.
And then at the time, Bishop Fernandez went in, and then I guess he was made a cardinal.
That's correct.
All right. So this is the guy who wrote the famous book, Heal Me With Your Mouth, The Art of Kissing, in 1995.
Yeah.
What the hell's that about?
This is a question that's going to be looked at historians. Why did Pope Francis surround himself with people who are manifestly unsuited to the position they had? A Catholic priest writing a book on kissing as some kind of spiritual, mystical way of looking at life, no. Put that in the garbage. Get yourself a real interest that's according to what the bishop and a priest are supposed to do. Cardinal Fernandez is unsuited to the job, and I hope that he loses the job because I don't think he's done a good job there at all. But on the other hand, he did a good job for Pope Francis because Pope Francis put him there and kept him there.
Yeah,
so
right.
this will be a sea change. Either we get a new approach or more of the same.
And Cardinal Fernandez really comes up. Was he in the conclave then? He would have been a voting cardinal.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But he would have. I think he wrote a lot of documents or follow up the responses to people's questions about Traditionis, Custodes, and some others. So you've written about some of those I think, what do you call it, the Responsa?
Yeah, the Responsa. Yeah,
and so we kind of get an inside view of his opinion on things through some of that, and his answers seem to push the issue even further than what the papal documents seem to say.
Well, the papal documents said some things, they left other things unsaid. My critique of some of those papal documents was they were poorly written.
Yeah.
They didn't have consistency of logic. Sometimes they left out aspects. And Cardinal Fernandez, I view him as basically, he's like a guy who writes copy at a newspaper. In other words, here's something, do it. He's not theologically sophisticated, in my opinion. And certainly, this is not the
He's
person,
not up to the job.
Not up to the job,
Right.
in my opinion.
All right. So last two questions about Leo, and we're going to talk about Leo, kind of what he might have to say or what he is faced with in all the other subjects that we cover. But two specific things, I don't know where to fit it. And these are unfair questions, so I admit that.
You ask unfair questions?
I do, right. So the first is, do you have any sense for what Pope Leo would do, likely do, should do, whatever you want to say about the Vigano situation?
Well, the Vigano situation, for the listeners who may not be aware of it, is that he was a Vatican employee for many years as in the Vatican Roman Curia. He became a nuncio. He was nuncio in the United States. He was here when Pope Francis visited in 2015. And he was the nuncio who told Pope Francis, they had a meeting in Rome, and Pope Francis asked him, what do you think about McCarrick? And Vigano said, he's a very bad man. He's done some very bad things. And then the Pope seemed not to be interested at all in Vigano's statements about that. And McCarrick exercised an influential role in the pontificate of Pope Francis until he was exposed by a courageous former seminarian who said that this guy sexually molested him at St. Patrick's Cathedral in the sacristy bathroom. I mean, this is the type of crimes that he was involved in. So Vigano, as a result of, he had a conflict with Pope Francis because he told Francis about McCarrick, and when the McCarrick revelations came out, then Vigano wrote a memorandum about what he told Francis. And Pope Francis, at first, his only answer was, I'll let the media investigate it. I'm not going to say anything more. And then maybe a year and a half later, he told a Mexican journalist that he said, I knew nothing. And then he said, I can't remember if we discussed McCarrick when I met with Vigano. So he gave kind of an inconsistent answer. You can't remember whether you talked to him about it, but you're sure that you don't know anything about it. It doesn't make sense. That's kind of, be precise. So anyway, Vigano basically continued his campaign of public statements. He was very vehement that the Pope, and he had that conversation, he told him about it, and that the Pope was not being forthright about it. And Vigano eventually was disobedient and refused. He was accused of some canonical crimes. He would not respond to them, and he was excommunicated. And that's where he stands now. So
that's a big step. I mean,
it was, but I mean, I'm a canon lawyer. Excommunication doesn't mean you're thrown out of the church. You're always a member of the church because you're always baptized, and you can, fail to fulfill your obligations, and you can also be punished. Excommunication means you're denied access to the sacraments, and you can't hold office in the church until you have the excommunication lifted, which is done by basically repenting.
Yeah.
So I would be very nice if Vigano could be reconciled. We'll see if Pope Leo wants to, pursue that path. But
how much of his excommunication was due to his public statements of sedevacantism, like basically saying that, he seemed to indicate, I don't know how directly he did it, that Pope Francis wasn't a legitimate pope. He seemed to complain about the some of those technicalities in the conclave, and I don't know how accurate those are, but
no, they're not accurate. There's a school of thought that came up. Well, Pope Francis, ended up doing very bad things, so he really can't be the pope, and therefore he really wasn't elected because XYZ happened. And then there's questions about a ballot where there was a blank ballot, and
right.
The College of Cardinals the election.
The guy, yeah.
He was elected. It was recognized as valid at the time. None of the cardinals at the meeting protested that there was an invalidating cause, nor have they since subsequently. So that I don't buy that line of thought at all.
Yeah. Well, all right. Let's change subject then. And the Archbishop Vigano, which I don't even know if you should call him Archbishop Vigano.
Yeah, so he's still an Archbishop. Yeah.
Okay.
Even he wasn't defrocked. He wasn't thrown out of the priesthood.
Yeah, he wasn't laicized or anything like McCarrick was.
McCarrick was, yes.
So Archbishop Vigano, I pray for him. I hope that he comes back in. I think he's done a lot of good things and made a lot of important statements and opened up a lot of people's eyes to problems in the world. I hope he can get reconciled with the church. I really hope.
I hope so too.
Very different. I don't want to imply that these two are similar cases because there's a Grand Canyon between the two. But what about Bishop Strickland and his status? Do you have any sense, of what Leo could do in that kind of situation?
That's easy. He could simply give him a new assignment. He was removed as Bishop of Tyler, Texas. I don't think it was canonically proper the way it was done. I don't think substantively either that it was a just act, but the Pope has the ability to do it, but canonically it was improperly done. He was in effect punished, but he committed no crime.
Yes.
Canonical crime. It is not a canonical crime to disagree with the Pope, if he made some intemperate statements which were cited at the time, things he had said about the Pope, those you can request an apology for, or ask, well, what was the reason you said and what did you mean by it? But he never said Pope Francis is not the true Pope. He never did anything like that. So that which is a canonical offense, if you push it, that that you have make an absolute assertion people should not obey this man because he's not the Pope. That's rebellion. That's not Strickland didn't do anything like that. He just criticized some papal actions.
Yes. Well, I consider Bishop Strickland a friend now, and he came on my show, and I went to visit him. So
he's a good man.
We love
Bishop unfairly,
Strickland.
in my opinion.
Yes, no doubt about it. I think he's a victim, and I think he's a very prayerful, holy man now who's doing a lot of good things in the church. So, okay, those are the questions I essentially had about, like, what's immediately kind of that comes to mind that doesn't fit into these other categories with Pope Leo. But let's move on to the broad category of tradition and the sacred liturgy. You've written extensively about it, very clearly. You're a voice of common sense and canonical clarity. Traditionis, Custodes, as this came out, you wrote quite a lot about it. But here's my fundamental question about this document. I hear many good priests talk about this document, especially in our diocese where we've just had the Latin Mass really quite relegated to a particular place outside of town, just making it more inconvenient. And so there's a lot of dispute going on about whether a bishop has the right to do it. And I'm not saying he does or does not. But here's a point I want to try to make. People say, and I've heard many good priests say it, and maybe they're right, I want you to clarify, that Pope Benedict lifted the restrictions on the Latin Mass, and then Pope Francis basically put them back on. And I don't know that that's correct. It seems to me that Pope Benedict, what he did in Summorum Pontificum was to recognize the rights that have always been there, and said, go basically exercise the rights that you have. And then Pope Francis imposed restrictions. That is not the same thing as one pope lifting a restriction and another pope implementing the restriction again. It seems like a fundamental theological difference between the two about the rights in regards to the Latin Mass. Can you help clarify that?
Sure. Well, your point about Pope Benedict is based on something that he said in Traditionis Custodes or in the accompanying letter.
Benedict,
thank you for Curia. Pope Benedict said that the old Mass, meaning the traditional Latin Mass, had not been abrogated.
Right, that was not Traditionis Custodes. You just misspoke.
Yes, that's Summorum Pontificum.
Correct.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm confusing my
right.
Latin terms.
That's right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We all need a helper here.
That's
so, and that statement, though, was based on a canonical historical investigation that had been done by some cardinals. But I had problems with that at the time, because
really?
if it had not been abrogated, then why was it prohibited and not celebrated? And why were people who did it, penalized? So
yes, it's confusing to me.
No, but I think it was, Paul VI may not have signed a document stating, I abrogate the old Mass, but his intention that the old Mass no longer be celebrated once the new Missal was published was clear. And that was understood by the majority. Almost every single Catholic bishop in the world understood it and implemented it.
Huh.
And I think, I don't think that was a great idea, what Paul VI did in that regard. It would have been much better if they could have had both missals being used based on local, interests. But back to your question then, Pope Benedict did lift restrictions. Now, John Paul II was the one who had given permissions, and he gave multiple permissions, and particularly after the illegal consecrations of bishops by Archbishop Lefebvre.
Yeah.
He, brought in the priest fraternity of St. Peter was formed, and then priests could have permission you originally had to write to the Vatican to get permission, then they kind of delegated it to local bishops. So the Latin Mass was celebrated starting in, the late 1980s in many dioceses and locations. But Pope Benedict made it even broader, because you no longer need permission from your bishop, because some bishops didn't like it and they wouldn't give permission for it. So he said, any priest can celebrate the Latin Mass if there's a community with people of interest to celebrate it.
Even publicly?
Yeah, publicly.
Okay, so was it Benedict's statement, I guess, that at any parish, whether the local bishop liked it or not,
yeah,
the priest could stand up and say the Latin Mass at the regular 10 a.m. Mass instead of the Novus Ordo?
That's correct.
Wow.
If the priest had to know Latin, and there had to be a stable community of the faithful who would be interested in having that.
Okay. So that was like the one qualifier, is that you kind of needed a community that wanted
qualifier, but of course that's subject
pretty relative.
Well, subject to saying, well, the reason we don't have people interested is they've never seen it before, so
right.
We're going to start it again to see if people get interested, and that's primarily what's happened since. Mm-hmm. So he removed it from the control of the bishops because he encountered this problem that many bishops were ungenerous. They wouldn't give permissions under John Paul II's legislation to have the Latin Mass, and the Pope. Both John Paul II and Benedict wanted to reconcile the followers of Archbishop Lefebvre, but there was disagreement about how much theological rigor or let's say theological agreement had to be reached because of the critiques of Archbishop Lefebvre and his followers of the Second Vatican Council. So that's a whole nother topic we can talk about. So I think the long and the short of it is, Pope Benedict did liberate the traditional Latin Mass from restrictions. Pope Francis reimposed many restrictions and even made it much stricter, because, you may recall that in Traditionis Custodes, when it first came out, it said anyone ordained after this date needs to inform the Holy See if they want to celebrate the Latin Mass. They later changed it, need permission of the Holy See to celebrate the Latin Mass, and the Holy See would not give permission to newly ordained priests. So, the basic idea, obviously, is we're going to stamp this Mass out because there won't be any priests to celebrate once the older ones die. And I have tremendous disagreement with that policy.
Do you have disagreement like theologically or canonically?
Well, theology and doctrinally and canonically, if something is good and spiritually fruitful in the life of the church, and you recognize it because you continue to allow it to be celebrated, why in the world would you prohibit one class of priests from celebrating it as opposed to a different class of priests?
Yeah. But did Pope Francis have the right to do what he did?
He does have the right to do it legally because he's the lawgiver and he establishes. Now, you could say, morally speaking, is suppression of a form of the Mass that was present in the church for more than 1,000 years. Is this something subject to, the decision of a pope to say, I don't like this anymore, I'm going to prohibit it? That's where you have a serious debate, because the reason the Pope has supreme authority in the church is to promote the mission of the church, not to harm it. And he didn't think he was harming it, obviously, because he wouldn't have done it if he did. But I think there's a good case that we could try to convince him he was.
Yeah.
Didn't happen, but I think the case could be made.
What do you think Pope Leo's going to do?
This I don't know. There are reports that he celebrated the Old Mass. There was one report I saw that someone who was at the Old Mass celebrated by Father Prevost years ago. If that's the case, certainly he doesn't think it's harmful.
Yeah.
And certainly he thinks, by doing it, he has the experience of seeing it. He did grow up. Granted, he's 69 years old, so his memory of the Old Mass would be very young. He'd be a little kid, and then we went to the Old Mass in English for a few years, so he might remember that better. But
do you think that because he's the first public Mass, he said the consecration in Latin? I think he did. I think I read that.
Yeah, I think so.
Is that a statement?
No, because the Pope Francis has celebrated Mass in Latin frequently at the Vatican, because when you have these great Masses on Easter and Christmas, it's typically lots of Latin, some Italian, and that's a few other languages thrown in for readings and petitions. But no, Latin is still used in the Roman Curia and in the Roman liturgy in Vatican City State.
All right, let me ask you, since you're a canon lawyer, a pretty technical question here. Let's accept the fact that a bishop now in a diocese can say no more Latin Mass, or he can relegate it over to a certain place or whatever, because under the power given to him in Traditionis Custodes. Okay, can he regulate the Novus Ordo in Latin?
The bishop has to observe the general law of the church, and the regulation that would be that he has power over the celebration of the new order. I mean, that's an informal term, but the Roman Missal in its current version, that's subject to the rule of general law. He can't prohibit things that the general law of the church permits. So he can make provisions such that the pastoral needs of the faithful will be met. So he could, for instance, mandate that a parish celebrate Mass not only in English but also in another language to serve a faithful group. That's consistent with general law that the vernacular liturgy is meant to be drawing people into vernacular worship. If they don't know English, you got to find their vernacular. Prohibiting the Latin Mass would be out of bounds. He doesn't have the right to do that.
The Novus Ordo in Latin.
The Novus Ordo in Latin, because that's, if the Pope is the model, the way the Pope does things liturgically is the model for us to follow. And certainly he celebrates Mass in Latin. If it's fine in Rome, it should be fine in any diocese that's in communion with Rome.
Mm-hmm. What about ad orientem?
Ad orientem cannot be forbidden by the local bishop because it's permitted in the Roman Missal. It's not forbidden. Rome, the Vatican Holy See is never forbidden ad orientem. And the way the Roman Missal is written, it is as if the Mass is being celebrated ad orientem, because at times it refers to the priest turning to face the people or facing the people.
It's in the rubrics, right?
Exactly, it's in the rubrics.
It says turn and face the people,
so
which implies you're not facing the people.
No, which of course, and if all you have to do is know the historical context that when the new Mass was written, the altars were facing the people. The altars were facing east. Now, they did authorize, even during Vatican II and in session, that Mass could be altars could be detached from the wall, or that people could be celebrated facing the people. but it was an authorization. It wasn't a change saying you can no longer do it the old way. You have to do it the new. Now, de facto, it's like the word new improved, Yeah. Why would anybody buy the old product if you got your new and improved product? But the answer was it wasn't so improved.
So I heard one example of when the Vatican actually did rule for a United States diocese that ad orientem was not permitted. And it was the Birmingham diocese where EWTN is. And the bishop at the time wanted to prohibit ad orientem for TV masses, like masses on television, only that. And he had some reason for that. And so they had to write a specific request to the Vatican and say, we would like permission to prohibit ad orientem only in publicly celebrated masses that are televised. And the Vatican approved that. But the point there is, look at the extent to which they had to go to prohibit ad orientem. And that had to be done because they knew they couldn't restrict it otherwise. So to think that a bishop can just go randomly do this is a bit out of bounds.
It's beyond their power. It's called ultra vires in Latin. It's beyond their power. They don't have the power to prohibit it according to the law that they swear they're going to enforce when they become bishops. Canon law and liturgical law is a restriction on the freedom of decision of both the priests and the bishops about how the liturgy is celebrated.
Without getting into like specifics, because I don't really want to do that given the situation in Charlotte. What generally speaking, what is a bishop's authority, not in any diocese, his authority over the liturgy? Like, how does canon law handle that?
Well, he is, the expression chief liturgist is used, that he's he's responsible for the liturgy in the diocese. So he has to promote observance of liturgical order in his diocese to make sure people are following the rubrics, celebrating the Mass reverently, the other sacraments worthily. He should be encouraging promotion of sacred art to decorate churches and things of that sort. As regards making specific provision for language needs, obviously he can mandate that, Father X, you have a lot of Spanish people here, you've got to start a Spanish Mass. Mm-hmm. As regards, prohibiting things that the Missal itself allows, he can't do that. And simply issuing a letter or a decree stating this is now the law in our diocese, no. If he issues it in a formal decree, then it's the right of a pastor or any member of the faithful, to be honest, to write to the bishop, say, could you please withdraw this decree because it conflicts with the universal law of the church? And if he refuses, then you say, well, we're going to now have recourse to the Congregation for Divine Worship because we think you're depriving the people of their right to liturgical celebrations according to the universal law of the church, and that this restriction that you've imposed does harm to our ability to worship according to what the church itself offers to the faithful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to go much deeper into it than that right now, but thank you for that general overview. But back to the Traditionis Custodes situation, you've written some interesting things that I didn't realize. That I knew it, but you brought a kind of awareness to the absurdity of this. With Traditionis Custodes, the result is that SSPX, this is the Society of St. Pius X, has more rights with the Latin Mass than we do. I mean, it's kind of an irony in the sense of somebody who's was at one time schismatic, I suspect. They're brought back in, the excommunications are lifted. But this is a trap to just like send people over to the SSPX, which they have some problems. I mean, they're irregular, I guess is the word.
Yeah.
But they have the right, under Pope Francis, they had the right to do the Latin Mass and to celebrate the sacraments. And yet we don't.
Well, no, this is
a real problem.
It is a
mind.
problem, and it's a problem of logical inconsistency.
I mean, it's like you're being rewarded for being bad.
Well, what it is that the situation of your disobedience is not addressed, whereas they count on the obedience of people who are attending the Latin Mass as authorized, by the Holy See, that they're going to obey now, saying, well, you can't go to this Mass anymore, and in the future you won't be able to, so everybody has to go back to the new Mass. It's logically inconsistent.
Yeah,
I agree, and I approve of efforts to try and resolve the canonical irregularity of the Society of Pius X, because, the vast majority of people, in my estimation, are good people, and are, upset by the way things have gone in the Church since the Council ended. And I think those concerns are legitimate in general. I don't accept every critique they make, but I think it's well worth trying to make a deal, so to speak.
Yeah.
But Pope Francis basically said, and this is spiritual charity, said, I give them faculties to hear confessions, the priests of Pius X. They can also perform weddings. And
what, did Benedict do that, or Francis?
No, this was Pope Francis. Yep.
I thought Benedict did that when he lifted the excommunication.
No, this is no, the excommunication was lifted, but they were never regularized.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Thank you for that.
And yes, I mean, they don't operate under the canonical regulation of the Holy See or the local diocese the way the Fraternity of St. Peter and Institute of Christ the King do. And then on the other hand, they cooperate. Pius X cooperates with the Holy See in cases of trying to have priests dismissed because of canonical crimes. They send those cases to the Doctrine of the Faith. They're allowed to celebrate Mass by some churches. Even the Holy See invited them on Holy Year pilgrimage to enter St. Peter's as a group. Huh. They celebrate Mass in the Lord's Shrine. So there's a lot of contradictions going on.
Oh, it's totally contradictory.
Yeah.
So they're here. This is very important, and I haven't talked to anybody about this on the podcast, and this was not in my notes, but you wrote about them, so you know something about it. We have a chapel here, SSPX, in this diocese.
Yes.
And as the restrictions on the Latin Mass have occurred, it's that people are flocking there. And people, lay people, at least lay people, they have a lot of differences of opinion about whether that's legitimate or not, whether they can go to that and does that fulfill their Sunday obligation, etc. Well, I won't share my opinion. What do you tell me, as a canon lawyer, does that fulfill the Sunday obligation, given that our bishop and our previous bishop had not given people permission to go there? So what do you do with that?
Well, no, this is one of the issues after the lifting of the excommunication by Pope Benedict of the 4 illegally consecrated bishops. The expectation was that there would be a canonical regularization of all the priests, and because they were operating outside of canonical supervision by the Holy See. That never came about because there was a discussion between the Holy See and representatives of Society of Pius X regarding theological issues, because the Pius X Society always maintains our issue is not obedience, our issue is theological errors in the Second Vatican Council. And the Holy See, and they discussed it for quite a while. They never came to an agreement. I say it'd be worth restarting those things. And then we can look at their critiques of Vatican II, see whether they in fact can prove that there was error taught by Vatican II. I don't think so. I don't believe there was error taught there. I think you can say there's some imprudent things which are can be discussed, and matters that can be better explained. But anyway, we'll leave it at that.
Watering things down is not necessarily doctrinal error. Something I was told a long time ago, it's like infallibility doesn't mean always right. It means never wrong.
Well, infallibility means that Pope will not teach anything erroneous.
Yes. That's what I'm saying. Sure. And so I think you can look at
doesn't mean he'll be the greatest teacher.
Exactly.
Or that the document will be stated in the best possible fashion.
Exactly. And I think that they kind of probably confuse that. They probably
no, I mean they have some serious critiques. Some, we won't go into them now because I need to refresh my mind on some of them, particularly on religious liberty is one of the big things.
Yeah.
But that's an area of intersection between prudence and teaching.
All right. So short answer though.
Yes.
Can a person in the Charlotte Diocese, when the bishop has not given permission for the SSPX chapel to be present here, can we go to that?
I don't recommend going to that chapel, but it does fulfill your obligation, strictly speaking, because it's a Catholic Mass. These are disobedient Catholic priests who are celebrating it because they're not submitting to the authority as individually or collectively of the Holy See and the local diocese. So
it's quirky then.
It's a problem because on the other hand, the Pope said, if you go to confession of them, it's a valid confession, and he says if you want to get married by them, it's a valid marriage. So wait a minute. If you can do one, if you can do the lesser, you should be able to do the greater. Yeah. If I'm going to, the purpose of confession, one of them is so that you'll be in a state of grace for receiving communion. So if it would be something to say, well, you can, the priest is hearing confessions before Mass at the chapel. You can get a valid absolution there, but you shouldn't go to the Mass. The problem is, of course, this is prudential judgment or judgment of pastoral charity. It's not a good idea to encourage people to go to a Mass at which they may hear sermons which give them bad ideas or cause them to become dissidents and schismatic in spirit, meaning that rejecting the authority of the Holy See or the local bishop. And I don't go to sermons that Pius X priests, so I don't know if that's what's happening, but it's always a danger that has to be felt.
So if a Benedictine order wanted to move into our diocese and just set up a new monastery, they'd have to get the bishop's approval, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the question is, yes. That's a subject of law regarding religious. I mean, they are exempt, meaning they'd be under direct control of the Holy See, but I can't remember whether they need permission or simply inform the bishop. I think it's probably permission, but I'll say that's an area of law I need to review.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think a religious community can just show up and set up shop. I mean,
Yeah, but
need some kind of bishop's approval, unless the Vatican. I guess the Pope can overrule that.
Well, see, this is it. I mean, you have these exempt orders which are under the jurisdiction of the Holy See, not under the local bishop.
Right.
But typically, the way it was the other way around. The bishop invites the Benedictines to come in. They don't just go and barge in.
Right.
Because the bishop wants Benedictine priests or Jesuits or Franciscans, whatever it is.
Yeah. But I mean, the analogy is that if they just barged in, there's something irregular about that. And like the question of whether we should go to them, like we are under Bishop Martin's church here in this diocese, right? I mean,
He's the bishop
here. He's
the
successor of the apostles.
Absolutely.
And so that has to be respected. And so anyway, I just kind of wanted to say that.
The Bishop Bruskowitz of Lincoln issued a decree forbidding people to go to the Pius X chapel in his diocese. A chapel run by the Pius X priests. Yeah. The bishop here could do the same.
He could, yeah.
Yeah, because and motivated by saying the spiritual welfare of the faithful is endangered when they attend Mass regularly for a group of priests who are not under the not acting in a canonically regular way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's a slippery slope because we have to remain Catholic. We cannot allow a Protestant mindset to slip in to where we just don't need bishops. Which, by the way, that Protestant mindset we'll get to when we start talking about synodality. But we're not there yet. Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much. Let's move to the topic of homosexuality and transgenderism in the church, and particularly Fiducia Supplicans, if I'm saying that correctly. Supplicans.
Yes.
Is this the weirdest document that's ever come out of the Vatican?
It's one of the worst.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There's no doubt.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to explain it for the people that don't know what it is?
Yeah. So Pope Francis issued a document, or approved the publication of a document by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, the Castery of the Doctrine of the Faith, it's now called, which allows for the blessing of same-sex couples.
Would that mean Fernandez was the author of it?
He signed the document.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, keep going.
Sure. So the document is very bad because it does a few things. It treats same-sex couples as analogous to mixed-sex couples. In other words, a man and a woman are called a couple, and then two men who are in some kind of relationship that is based on either actual or potential sexual activity with each other, that they're also called a couple. The church has never called two homosexuals a couple because it's impossible. They're not a couple. Couple in Catholic theology and usage refers to people who enter into a relationship patterned on God's plan of creation and revealed in Adam and Eve.
Yes.
That man and woman were made for each other to be mutual supports and then to come together to propagate the species. So the purpose of sex is propagation of the species through in a committed married relationship that's based on a lifelong promise of fidelity. That's what sex is about. Sex is not about two men committing sodomy with each other and calling themselves a couple. So they're called a couple in Fiducia Supplicans, which is wrong. They're not a couple. And the basis by which the basis by which they constitute themselves to call themselves a couple is that they either will or are having immoral sexual activity between themselves. And the church has never considered that form of, let's say, association between two people to be blessable. Never. In fact, Pope Francis also approved about a year and a half earlier than Fiducia Supplicans, another document from the Doctrine of the Faith, which said you can't bless sin, you can't bless these couples. So Fiducia Supplicans contradicted what Pope Francis had ordered, published, or permitted, or authorized for publication earlier in his pontificate, which shows the chaotic nature of this whole thing, because by your second document, you've already condemned yourself because you were originally told people they can't do this. You can't change moral principles on the basis of the calendar and say, well, what I said yesterday about being immoral, I don't say that anymore because it's no longer immoral. Well, how did that happen? We're entering the world of make-believe, which is the pretend world that homosexuality being approved by the church, that's a whole world of pretending. We're pretending two men are a couple. We're pretending that their sexual activity is not mortally sinful. We're pretending that they're blessable in the same way that, it happens frequently. Two people get engaged and they come to the church and say, we want to get married. Can you give us a blessing as we're getting ready to get married? Of course I can. You're entering the path of virtue and sacramental life. Two men who come to the church and say, we sodomize each other, they won't use that language. They say no. They'll use some euphemisms about it. But,
the old language is so much better than the new language.
Well, because it expresses reality quite clearly.
Yeah.
Same-sex sexual activity is a mouthful. And it, strictly speaking, the only sex is only between a man and a woman. Every other usage is a misuse of sex. So it's not really sex per se. It's a misuse,
Which is sodomy.
Yeah, which is sodomy, which applies to the behavior of two people who are of the same sex involving sexual organs. So this is the world of make-believe. It's the world of tearing down both reality and the moral evaluation of reality. Very, very dangerous.
How do you bless a couple without blessing the coupleness?
You can't. One of the critiques, and even Pope Francis said at one point in an interview, we're only blessing individuals. It doesn't say that in the document. Yeah. And by the way, if that's the case, rewrite it then. But they never did. It says couple. Couple is a description of the status of two people who are seen together. Okay, you see, there are a couple of farmers walking down the street. In that case, the couple just means two. There's a young man and a woman, holding hands and walking on the seashore. That's a couple. We assume they're either married or looking toward marriage, or maybe, who knows, exploring, maybe they should get married. So yeah, you cannot say we're blessing them as individuals and not their relationship, because that's not the way it works if you call them a couple. So this is all.
That's the make-believe part.
It's the make-believe part.
Pretending that words don't mean what words mean.
And the reason they do is because they, the proponents of the homosexual lifestyle they say, of course they're a couple. Homosexual activity is just a variant on matrimonial activity between a man and a woman. So as a result, but we know that shocks people, so we'll get into this pretend world. Well, you're blessing them as individuals, even though they're holding hands, and even though they got married in a civil ceremony, and even though they call themselves Mr. and Mrs., and Mr. and Mr., no, this is wrong. The real problem here, of course, is you're leading people into mortal sin and confirming them in the erroneous notion that it's not really mortal sin, because it's not even sinful, because for them it's an expression of a different form of love than what man and wife have. So it's just terrible.
Doesn't the document make all these explanations or disclaimers saying this is not a wedding, and it's like you can't dress up like you're in a wedding, and you can't do a lot of things that you're in a wedding? Doesn't that betray the fact that it's confusing with a wedding, like or a wedding blessing? It's
pretense, because of course the people who are doing it, they're saying this is our form of a wedding, or they were already married civilly, so they just want the church's approval of it. Now, when you start writing, in a document that's supposed to be guiding people about, how to act as in a Christian moral way, and you start getting into details about the nature of a celebration at which this is going to be, can't be carried out in the context of XYZ. This is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Everybody knows what it is. This is silliness. To say it's not a wedding. Well, why would anyone think it was a wedding? Precisely because the people engaged in it think they're married to each other. So, Father James Martin was pictured in the New York Times a day or two after this document came out. He brought a photographer and a reporter to two homosexuals who were holding hands, and he was giving them a blessing. Okay, that's what this is all about. Two men who think they're married, or want to be married, but certainly want to be in a sexual relation with each other, and the church is approving it.
You've written a lot of articles about Father James Martin. He seems to be was very empowered during this papacy. What's he doing?
Father Martin has been promoting the homosexual lifestyle for years, and he was given favor by Pope Francis. He was appointed to the Dicastery for Communication. He was appointed twice to attend the Synod on Synodality. Pope Francis would write letters to, he holds a conference promoting homosexuality every year at Fordham in past few years, and Pope Francis would send greetings to the conference. The most famous Jesuit in the United States is a promoter of homosexual lifestyle.
Yeah.
And that's, Pope Francis is part of the reason why he's so famous.
Yeah. When he was named, I think, into a Vatican position of head of a communications office.
Not head, he's a member of the office, yeah.
Pope Francis knew that was a purpose. He knew what he was doing.
Oh, no, he's praised him for his ministry, as he terms it. No,
this is hard to. It's hard to grasp.
It's not a nice fact, but it is a fact, and it's Father Martin is confirming people in mortal sin, and this is when you go to someone's home with a photographer, so you can get basically a propaganda photo on the front page of the New York Times. A Catholic priest is comfortable with two homosexuals holding hands with each other who are involved in a sexual relationship, and the Catholic Church thinks this is blessable. Well, that's on Pope Francis and Father Martin.
Yeah.
And that's what we got. And
is he up there in New York with you?
He lives in New York Archdiocese,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, do you guys ever run into each other?
I've seen him a few times, not lately, but we're on friendly terms. Years ago, I would see him occasionally. I haven't seen him in a long time.
You wrote a review or something of his book. I'm trying to remember which book was that.
Building a bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, that was Father Martin's, he wrote an essay about basically how the Catholic Church should treat people with a homosexual identity or I call it a problem with homosexuality. and then it was expanded into a small book. And but it's all about promoting homosexual life. He never deals with courage, which is the apostolate established in the Archdiocese of New York by Cardinal Cook and Father Benedict Rochelle and Father
Paul Check?
No, not Father Paul Check.
Well, he ran
Father
it.
John Harvey.
John
he was
Hardin?
Harvey.
Harvey.
He was a moral theologian. And
Okay.
so the three of them, Cardinal Cook's request, Father Harvey and Father Rochelle established this apostolate to help people with a homosexual problem live chastity and to live healthy and holy lives.
And that's still going strong.
It is going strong, and it's a very wonderful apostolate. So Father Martin's book is about how do the church and homosexuality. Never talks about courage. So in other words, he never addresses the reality that the Catholic Church recognizes that it has a need to assist people to live a virtuous life. Instead, he writes an apologia for why the church should accept the fact that some Catholics are comfortable with committing homosexual acts and that the church, has to make an accommodation there. It's a very bad book.
Did you see his book on Jesus? I think it was just called Jesus.
I have not.
Yeah. I mean,
No.
he's written some other things.
No, he wrote a book about the Jesuits. He wrote a book about saints. He's written a number of books.
Right. Courage. Do you know much about what do they do? Do they help homosexuals
Yes.
rehab, or what do they do?
Well-
and I'm actually going to have Father Paul Check on my show soon.
Okay.
He's coming in, so I'll kind of get some.
Well, he can
more
talk about it
Yeah, he will.
extensively.
He
But
will,
I knew Father Harvey. I was involved as one of the priest chaplains
Oh, cool.
years ago with Courage.
Yeah.
And it was basically a 12-step type program. It was modeled on Alcoholics Anonymous.
Sure.
And the idea was to help people who have a difficulty to be able to live chastity and to get emotional and fraternal support. So the groups, so there's a men's courage and a female courage. And they get spiritual guidance from a priest. Father Harvey wrote a number of articles and books. You can find out his thinking and his approach. So it's a good program. It's helped lots of people.
Does it? Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I've seen it. But for Father Martin, it's as if it never existed.
Never existed.
Which is,
because he doesn't see that there's an illness that needs to be healed.
well, he obviously doesn't think that homosexuality is a problem. He thinks it's a gift from God. That God made you this way. He more or less, I think that's one of the assertions he makes in various of his writings.
He doesn't make anything bad. He made you this way, therefore that's good.
Exactly.
He argues that in his book.
Sure, which is wrong because, of course, you're not bad as a person. You're created by God, but you can engage in bad activity. That's
Yeah.
why we have 10 Commandments.
God didn't create concupiscence, but we're born with them.
Concupiscence is a consequence of original sin. Yeah,
Right.
There was a disobedience to God by our first parents, and we all suffered as a result.
So one interesting, one of your articles, I can't remember which one, but this gets to the theological debate, I guess, going on in this whole issue. And I think it's really fundamental. It's worth dwelling on. I don't remember if it's Father Martin or if it's one of those bishops that is kind of along the ride with him. But they essentially argue that the notion of homosexuality being a disorder, that we need to stop using
That's
the term
right.
disorder. And if I recall, they're saying, well, when we hear the word disorder, we think of a psychological disorder, when the church, they say, means it in a philosophical way, and we need to stop using that word, and we need to use more sensitive language. So we should not say homosexual tendency is a disorder. Did I get that right? I mean, I think that's the theological debate at hand.
Father Martin says that in his book. We should no longer. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says this is intrinsically disordered behavior,
Intrinsically disordered, yeah.
and which is the same as inherently.
Yeah.
And he says no. We should say it's differently ordered, which is basically
Differently ordered.
Yeah, which is that's removing the moral evaluation of the behavior. Disorder means that things have a proper end or purpose in God's plan of creation, and that you can use things properly. You can nourish yourself by eating food. You can harm yourself by drinking poison. So you choose which thing you're going to do. And in the realm of sexuality, it's the same thing. You can use the sexual organs according to divine plan, or you can misuse them. And the other, when you misuse them, you're in a disordered manner. So no, they don't like the language because the language contains the evaluation.
Yeah.
One of my professors in seminary, Monsignor William Smith, said verbal engineering always precedes social engineering. And that's absolutely the case. That's why the church, one of the regrettable things under Pope Francis is they started using the acronym LGBT in Vatican documents. They've never done that before. And the reason is we don't accept that categorization of mankind. We don't say that there are distinct categories of people by divine will, and they're called gay, lesbian, transgender, and bisexual. We don't accept that. When a church document does that, that's saying, well, here's the reality. We believe that there's such bisexual people, and not as a sociological description, but as a description of who they are. This is the problem here. So when Father Martin can't accept the Catechism of the Catholic Church and says it needs to be changed, you have the whole evaluation right there. He is rejecting the Church's moral teaching, which is based on Christian anthropology. Christian anthropology is such that God created mankind with a purpose in mind, and therefore the body reflects that purpose.
There was I wish I could pause the podcast for a second while I find this, but there was an article that you wrote that talks about how Pope Francis, here it is, I found it.
Okay.
2016. Your article was entitled Sex, Words, and Reality.
Okay.
And this is kind of talking about that issue of words precede, what was the phrase you said?
Yeah, verbal engineering precedes social engineering.
Verbal engineering precedes social engineering. I mean, that's actually, I think that's something that probably Karl Marx probably understood very well.
Oh, sure.
And these guys, but I'm going to read this because I had never heard this. This was a quote from Pope Francis that he said on a plane on October 2nd, 2016. And this is Pope Francis speaking. Last year, I received a letter from a Spanish man who told me his story from the time when he was a child. He was born a female, a girl, and he suffered greatly because he felt that he was a boy but physically was a girl. He told his mother when he was in his 20s at 22 that he wanted to have an operation and so forth. His mother asked him not to do so as long as she was alive. She was elderly and died soon after. He had the operation. He is a municipal employee in a town in Spain. He went to the bishop. The bishop helped him a great deal. He is a good bishop, and he, quote unquote, wasted time to accompany this man. Then he got married. He changed his civil identity. He got married, and he wrote me a letter saying that it would bring great comfort to him to come see me with his bride. He who had been she, but is he. I received them. They were pleased. These are the words of Pope Francis.
They are
Unbelievable. And it's just incredible. But look at the permission he's giving this community to use these words improperly. He's giving credence to them by saying by saying married, by saying his bride. This is so strange. First of all, so wait a minute. I gotta do some mental okay, so he's actually a girl.
It's a female.
A female who tries to become male and then
thinks they're really a male.
A male, but then gets married to a female.
Yeah. Well, can't
and
get
brings
married.
his bride. So I mean, so wait, okay, so okay, all right, I think I got it straight. So we're dealing with a lesbian, basically.
No, we're dealing with a strange person,
right?
Or a person with a psychological disorder.
Did I get that right though? But it's a female with a supposed wife. What makes them
but they don't view themselves as two females.
No. But I'm saying in reality, it's actually a lesbian.
That's another problem. Lesbian is a description of women who engage in sexual activity, sexual misuse of sexual activity with other women.
Right.
It doesn't constitute them into a category of people.
Fair
It's
enough.
female people engaged in homosexual activity.
Right.
But anyway, that's
No, I hear you. I was just trying to actually get the gender, the actual gender straight in my head.
right.
So look, but the fact is, a lot of people have discussed, should we refer to a transgender person in the pronouns that they want or not?
Of course
and
not.
here we have the Pope doing it. I mean, we're doing it over and over, and he's recognizing a marriage, and he's recognizing an operation, and he's recognizing a bride, and he's receiving them, and they're pleased. What is he doing?
He's making multiple mistakes. He's scandalizing people. This is horrendous. He should never have done this. Other places, he says gender ideology was an imposition on people. But then again, here he's just endorsing it all by his use of language.
Yeah.
No, it's if the Pope sincerely believes that a woman who wants to be a man can become a man and therefore should be called a man, then he's lost at sea. And I think Pope Francis made this. This is not a characterization by a reporter. These are the actual words.
Yeah.
So, when people say, well, why are you upset with Pope Francis? Well, because he just said something no Pope in the history of the world ever said. Nobody ever expected a Pope to say it. If John Paul II and Benedict were standing next to him and he said all these things, they'd be horrified. So it's terrible. It's confirming people in this bogus idea that there's such a thing as a transgender person.
Mm-hmm.
There is no such thing. You're a male or you're a female. That's it. And that's by God's plan.
No, I think we all know now that transgender mindset was listed as a psychological disorder in the medical code or whatever that was, and now that's been removed, and so it's celebrated. So this is something that Pope Francis said about transgenderism. We talked about the homosexuality. What should the church be doing in regards to homosexuality and homosexuality has been around a long time, but the transgender stuff is still fairly new, on the block, and the church is dealing with it. Like, what should the church be doing if you were advising Pope Leo right now? That's a question. That's a good question. If you were advising Pope Leo right now, what would you advise him on in terms of the homosexual and on the terms of the transgender issues that have been very prominent during Pope Francis's tenure?
Well, he should issue a clear teaching document which states that the church, in affirming the actual order of creation, condemns the notion that a man could become a woman or vice versa, that the church condemns the notion that the use of sexual activity between people of the same sex is morally, can be called moral behavior. In other words, you have to reaffirm the teaching of the church right up to the pontificate of Pope Francis and just reaffirm what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, what the church has said in its various documents about homosexuality. This is unthinkable before Pope Francis that you would have a pope stating that a woman who thinks he's a man is a he and can get married to a woman, or in marrying a woman just describe it as if there was no problem. And then, yes, of course, to bless two people engaging in homosexual activity. No, we don't do that. So, no, it's, none of this stuff I ever anticipated when I was in the seminary that this would be taught by the Roman pontiff, the Pope.
Yeah.
These ideas were introduced. There was, different dissident priests who were promoting homosexuality and even whatever, transgenderism. Used to be called transsexualism. And then before that, it was called transvestism.
Transvestite.
So, the idea that people who have psychological disorders can somehow change what they are. No. We have to go back to basic morality. We evaluate human acts, and then we describe them as moral or immoral. And then as regards psychological perspectives, we recall that psychology is meant that the mind and body are in harmony with each other, so that the way you think is reflective of what you are. You're a mind, body, you're a soul and body composite. And there are two versions of the body by divine plan, the male version and the female.
I think it was a pretty famous statement that I forget which pope, was it Paul VI, that said the smoke of Satan has entered the church?
That is Paul VI, yes.
And was the smoke referring to homosexuality had made its way into the church? I heard that somewhere.
I don't think it was specifically that. No, I think it was that the propagation of error, heresy, immorality in general, but certainly the loss of faith, the you had theologians denying Catholic teaching right and left.
I mean, when I talk to priests who have lived in Rome and have some experience over there, they say that homosexuality is a real problem over there. How is it, do you think, that homosexuality made its way into the church so prominently? Because it's connected with the sex scandals and for sure. How did this happen? Because I thought it was kind of coming to an end. Because if you're an active homosexual, you can just live in the secular world and be called courageous. Why hide in the seminary like you might have had to do in the 40s or 50s or whatever because you weren't culturally accepted? I could see that. I could see a reason for men to hide in the seminary. But now, if you're gay, you can just be celebrated. So I thought we were coming to an end of this in the church, but maybe not.
Well, there's no end to sin. That's always going to be there. There are multiple questions. Why the phenomenon of priests committing this type of sin?
Yeah.
What's that caused by? But the other thing is the phenomenon of the Catholic Church seeming to, through its magisterial documents, seeming to approve of this behavior or tolerating it, if not approving it. That's got to end. We cannot, the people that James Martin blessed are committing sins worthy of eternal damnation. They need to know that. Father Martin should not be confirming them in sin. Hopefully those men will wake up and, understand that the teaching of the church trumps any opinions either by Pope Francis or Father Martin about homosexual couples are blessable and therefore their behavior is not abominable. It is abominable. Sodomy is an abomination in the sight of God. They don't like to hear that, but it's the reality. And it's the reason it's an abomination. It's a misuse of God's plan. Sex is where the divine and the human come together because, as your father of many children, the only creative act that God does in the world since the creation of the world is the creation of new souls for each newly conceived child. So therefore, that's the closest, let's say that's where God's action is experienced as a new creation. So as regards the phenomenon of homosexuals in the clergy, this is one of the it's one of the aspects of having a celibate clergy because it means people who don't want to get married because they're not interested in women can enter into a profession in which the fact that they don't get married, if they stayed as a layman, will never be asked because obviously they're, pledge their celibacy as a priest. And therefore, that's a place where people can go who have that particular difficulty. In fact, one of the jobs of seminaries is to make sure people don't get in for that reason, because that's not a reason to become a priest, so that your mom won't say, when are you going to get married?
Yeah, right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Did you ever read the Book of Gomorrah by St. Damien?
I've looked at it, but I've never read the whole thing.
Oh, my God.
No, so the sinful behavior has always been there.
Yeah.
And immoral clergy, it's been a problem from the beginning.
Yeah.
This is why seminaries have to be strict and teach virtue and weed out people who either reject virtue or, can't support the demands of being celibate. You know? So
yeah. I mean, that book was laying around here one day, and it was it was talking about how this has been a problem in the church for a long time. You get a bunch of men living in a monastery, this is going to be some kind of a problem, just statistically, I suspect. But and so but I was on a plane. I packed that book on the plane, and I had no idea what to expect, but I thought it was just talking about the history of clergy issues. And it's, I'm on a plane reading this, and I realized this thing is so graphic. It's who's the person sitting behind me? It's I can't read this on a plane.
Yeah.
But they were extremely, I think the point of it was that, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And the point in him writing that book was to wake up the church hierarchy in Rome to clamping down on this issue. And he was trying to find institutional, constraints to prevent these things from happening. So it's always been an issue, and I think there's some deep theological reasons for why Satan uses the sin of homosexuality. He could use a lot of different sins, but I think there's particular reason in his hostility towards the priesthood, towards the in persona Christi, that position that a priest steps into. A theory I've had that, and it's just my own, there's no weight to it at all, but the church fathers speculate that the devil fell from heaven because of the idea of the incarnation, that he could not worship this flesh, and that was just a grotesque idea to him. So perhaps, the thing that represents the incarnation the most in this world is the holy priesthood. And so when he attacks the priesthood, he wants to tempt them with the thing that's most contrary to the nature of that flesh itself, which is this grotesque act of sodomy. And so he wants to tempt them with that so that he can look at his other fallen angels that are sitting beside him in hell for eternity and say, see, that's why we were against the incarnation. Look at how disgusting the flesh is. He wants to kind of rub that in everybody's face, and the incarnation was a terrible idea. It never should have happened. So I'm totally putting my own words into this, but I see that as, I think when we see a permanent, long-term suffering in the church, there's actually a deep spiritual warfare going on for some reason, and the devil has his motives for instilling this problem into the priesthood for so long. Well,
he attacks, he doesn't want new souls to be created. He doesn't want new people to be born. The devil is opposed to the celebration of the sacraments. He's opposed to the Ten Commandments. The devil is full of hatred and tries to drag people down, as we know from Scripture. So, this is an aspect of this problem which people have to be aware of, that, embracing a homosexual lifestyle is not just a variant that's more comfortable for some people. No, it's entering into a diabolical way of life, which is based on lying and denying the purpose of sex. It's dehumanizing. You treat other people as just objects of sexual gratification in an unnatural way. This is wrong. This is not good.
Yeah. Pastorally, you're a pastor, I'm sure you've had to deal with the homosexual issue as a priest, but transgenderism, have you had to deal with that? I mean, are people starting to show up in the last 10 years that didn't before? Because this seemed to have almost become contagious in our society when all these young people are now transgender. I mean, I see it when I go to Starbucks, and I mean, it's just, it's kind of everywhere now. And 20 years ago, it wasn't. It just wasn't.
I haven't had much to do with it, to be honest, meaning dealing with people who come to me and say they're a male and they're really a female.
Right.
But you see it all around. You see people, men obviously dressing up like women and pretending they are. You see that all the time, sad to say, these days. So
in sports, it makes it in the news a lot with female sports.
Well, I mean, that's an aspect of fairness that's, exactly. You can't change your body. You cannot become a male if you're a female and vice versa. And bodily mutilation of sexual organs doesn't change who you are.
I guess if the far left wants to condone transgenderism, and if Pope Francis can start saying he when it's really a she,
right.
The logical consequence of that, one of many, is that a woman who starts calling herself a man should be able to be admitted to the seminary and become a priest.
No, there was a letter from the Holy See, or the American hierarchy. There was a letter a few years ago saying that you cannot accept females who claim to be men for ordination.
Yeah, I mean, of course, but I'm saying it's like that's the logical.
It is the logic.
If you follow that logic, if you're calling him a he, and you have to be a he to be admitted to seminary, why can't you admit him?
Of course. Well, and this is the disorder that's when you get into the world of make-believe, then you can't control which direction people are going to take it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, but it's just, if you just let that logic play out, you have to say, Holy Father,
I'm a man.
You can't call this woman a man.
Well, for not just consequences, just for truthfulness. You don't call females males,
Yes.
and that's what he's doing here.
Right.
It's a matter of truth.
Now, in terms of, from a pastoral standpoint, if you had transgenders in your parish, I don't want to necessarily talk about your parish per se, but just in general, do you deny? I don't think you do, but do you? You don't deny a transgender communion. I mean, he has no reason to. It is a public statement. Or do you? I mean, it's a confusing.
You have to. What do we mean by this? Someone who dresses like a female and is obviously a male, if they come up to communion, you have no reason to deny it to them.
I didn't think so.
Because who knows what they're doing. And these people are presumed to have a psychological disorder in most cases. There might be some ideological fanatics who, are completely rational about the whole thing and just say, "Well, I'm a revolutionary. I'm going to do this." But, people sincerely believe I'm really a girl in a boy's body. That's a disorder. If a man comes and says, "I'm really, I'm a horse," or I'm a giraffe, no one recognizes it, I'm really offended by them for not, then you say, look, you got a problem here.
Yeah.
If two people, come to you and say they want to get married, and they're incapable of getting married because they're both the same sex, even though one dresses like a man, you say, look, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
You got to stop this.
I didn't think you would deny somebody just ipso facto because they're clearly a transgender.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that a pastor has to allow them to be extraordinary ministers.
No, of course
they don't have
not.
to be cantors up in front of everybody. They don't have to be ushers.
Right.
Like, you don't have to give them public positions because there is something scandalous in that.
Well, there's something unusual, to say the least. If a man dresses like a woman and wants to take the collection, say, no, you're not a woman. Don't dress like one.
Yeah.
And your inappropriate dressing here is, is it in furtherance of your of an ideological point of view, claiming you think you're the other sex? So that's one thing. But
what a mess.
What a mess.
What a
It's
mess.
sad.
I mean, it's kind of like, I hate talking about it, but it's prominent. Like, how do you not talk about this when it's everywhere? And it's
not everywhere, because it's not the same in Africa and Latin America and in the Far East. We don't have a similar expansion of this thing. There's there's very little pressure in Africa to have same-sex marriage. That's coming from Europeans trying to tell the Africans what to do. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And when we were really researching the conclave and who the candidates were, and we were looking at that wonderful website that Diane and Edward and others, the College of Cardinals report is amazing. Well, the coolest website on the planet.
Yeah, great.
But when you're looking at their scorecards, each person, like where the Cardinals stand on things, you never really saw these Far Eastern, or what do you call them, Southern Hemisphere kind of Cardinals being in favor of woke ideology.
No, by and large, no.
But this is the segue to our next topic of synodality. You often see them in favor of synodality. Now, I want you to tell us a little bit about, I'll ask a question about why more of them were kind of in favor of synodality, but can you help us first, define synodality? And when the Synod on Synodality began, like 2 weeks into it, you wrote an article kind of prophesizing that we had a problem here. So take us a little bit through, like, what does the word mean?
Well, synod in Christian usage meant a meeting of bishops, the synod of, and in Latin, like Second Vatican Council was called, synodus. It's a synod is a gathering of bishops to consider matters of spiritual import in the life of the church, to consult, gain information and gain advice, and then to come to some conclusions about pastoral practice or doctrinal orthodoxy. So synods were meetings of bishops. Pope Paul VI, Vatican II, had a document which talked about forming something called the Synod of Bishops, which would be an instrument to assist the Holy Father, the Roman Pontiff, in the governance of the church. And it would consist of a group of bishops that were named to come to Rome periodically to advise the Pope on important matters. And the idea was, for some people, it looked like, like a Senate of the Church, although we say the College of Cardinals is the Senate. But it would be more like a legislative gathering to assist the president, in this case the Pope. But that's not what it is canonically. It's an advisory role because it's very valuable. The Roman pontiff, governs the whole church, but he doesn't have direct experience or knowledge of what's going on in all the regions.
Yeah.
He can read things and learn, and he can talk to people, but it would be good that the shepherds who are responsible for the pastoral care in those areas get together as a representative group to talk to the Pope about things. So that's what the Synod of Bishops was, and it's a meeting of bishops. There's some provision for religious order heads to have representation on it because of their governance, so to speak, of large religious orders which have a worldwide presence. But that has to do with an understanding of the relation between the priesthood and the episcopate. So the Synod of Bishops was that, and it met, every 2 or 3 years. They had extraordinary meetings, et cetera, et cetera. Pope Francis decided to strengthen or highlight the importance of this because he had 2 synods on the family, and those were going to be methods for promoting, for instance, communion for the divorced and remarried.
Okay, so Amoris Laetitia was a result of that.
It was a fruit of the 2 synods on the family, and also the lead-up discussions, because before the synod on the family, Pope recommended Cardinal Casper's writings, who wrote about giving communion, divorced, and remarried. And the first Synod of Bishops did not endorse it. There was also an introduction in the first Synod of Bishops in the interim report of an idea to, highlight the positive aspect of same-sex relationships. That got roundly rejected by that first Synod. Well, then the Pope changed the composition of Synod on the family too by bringing in more sympathetic cardinals and bishops and the like, cardinals and bishops to the Synod. But then years later, he said, well, we have to have a Synod on synodality. And then people said, well, what about getting other people involved? He said, yeah, we can do that. So they started buying lay people, women religious, priests, deacons. And that's where the Synod changed. It became the ex-Synod in reality, because there's no longer a Synod of bishops if non-bishops are part of it. And that's what we have. We call it the College of Cardinals if they had 10 lay people as, members of the College of Cardinals. Of course not.
Right.
We would say it's the College of Cardinals and lay people. And,
right.
you could make lay people cardinals, but then you change the nature of what it means to be a cardinal. So in this case, they didn't ordain these people to say, okay, you're going to be in the same status as the bishops. They simply say, well, you come now. And this is where we're going. So synodality is described as a style in the Vatican's way of doing things. And I think the impression is given that it basically means everybody has a say in how the church is governed. That's just not consistent with the divine constitution of the church. The church is governed by the shepherds, not the sheep. And if you're not a bishop or a priest, you're not in the authoritative role of a shepherd, because you're not configured to Christ the high priest. And this is where now synodality is going. It's arguing over church governance. And this is why you have lay people now given roles in the Roman Curia that were formerly given only to bishops or priests, because they're exercising governance in the church. And governance in the church is not a fruit of being baptized, it's a fruit of being ordained.
Is that people's issue with a nun being put in charge of the dicastery for religious?
Absolutely. Yeah, because the dicastery, the way the Roman Curia is organized, the Pope appoints other bishops and others to assist him, but the ones who make the decisions, because they have the authority to make decisions which are binding on the subjects, meaning the other bishops in the world, priests, lay people. So if you have authority to bind people through a coercive decree, saying you will do this, you will not do that, that is related to the fact that you exercise governing power in the church because you're ordained. Now they're saying, well, you can delegate that papal power to a lay person. But my answer is the layperson is not qualified to exercise the power you're delegating, because they're not. They are not constituted as a shepherd in the church. You can certainly have lay people working in those congregations as advisors and administrators and things that don't involve governing authority, which is great. I think that's, a good idea. But this is where we're going. So synodality is basically a democratization of the church, and it's reducing the role of the shepherd by saying that everyone can be a shepherd if the Pope designates them to be one. And I just don't agree with that.
Did the notion of synodality really kind of develop or kind of take effect under the German church? I mean, weren't they one of the first ones that pushed this synodality? They had their own way of doing everything.
They have a synodal way, they call it, which is more radical than even the Synod on Synodality was. But it's a similar principle. It's dissatisfaction with the current arrangements in which only bishops rule the church. And then what do we get? The demands for heretical notions like ordaining women priests, proving homosexual unions, all these immoral things and impossible things. You cannot ordain a woman a priest, even if she goes through the ceremony. So, but the Germans want the majority of the German bishops are in favor of this type of approach.
They seem to be in favor of a lot of weird approaches. I mean, something's off in that German church. You have any insight into that?
This is a triumph of the liberal spirit, which the Vatican Council was meant to strengthen the church in accomplishing its mission, but it was taken by some as a signal, everything's new and we can change things. Just because we did in the past doesn't mean we're forbidden to do it in the future. So they took that as, one of the biggest things after the council was the promotion of married clergy. And Paul VI said, no, we're not going to do it. And all the popes up till now, even Francis said we're not going to do it. So, but that spirit hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
The Germans incarnate it, but they're not the only ones. So, yeah, the idea was, and this is what Pope Benedict talked about, discontinuity and continuity. He said the Vatican II is in continuity with all previous councils. The others say, no, Vatican II was a turning point. What we did in the past, we no longer do. So that's discontinuity. So past practice can no longer guide how we implement Vatican II.
I mean, it seems like the left says discontinuity, and the extreme right, the radtrads, can say discontinuity because they feel like Vatican II was a complete rupture from the tradition. So it's kind of like the two extremes. Once again, they kind of meet. And
what I would say is that, people looking at what they want or what they observe, if they want it to be discontinuity, then they're going to act like it is. And then they'll do things which contradict previous practice. Those who observe it are mistaken in saying, well, Vatican II was the one that actually authorized this kind of stuff to be discontinuity. But they're seeing the discontinuity. It's discontinuity with the entire history of the church that a woman acting in the name of the Pope has executive authority and can compel bishops what to do in their diocese. I have nothing against women. I just said they're not shepherds. Yeah. If a man held that job who wasn't ordained, I'd have the same exact objection.
Right. You quote some passage from a handbook or something on the Synod on Synodality, and this came from the Synod office in Rome, and it talks about what the purpose of the Synod is. This is kind of powerfully awesome, like powerfully weird, I think is the word. So I'm just going to read it because it's striking. We recall that the purpose of the Synod, and therefore of this consultation, is not to produce documents, but, quote, and then he's quoting Pope Francis from the 2018 Youth Synod, quote, to plant dreams, draw forth prophecies and visions, allow hope to flourish, inspire trust, bind up wounds, weave together relationships, awaken a dawn of hope, learn from one another, and create a bright resourcefulness that will enlighten minds, warm hearts, give strength to our hands. And I read that, it's like, what about teaching? Like, what about teaching the faith? This is all emotion. This is all appealing to some kind of emotive response to try to make people feel good, I think, no matter what they're doing in their life. So this this is the purpose of a synod? That's what it's saying.
Well, guess what? The synod issued a document, and we, been dealing with it ever since. No, this is one way you kind of throw your opposition into chaos is saying, well, we're not meaning this, we're meaning that, and then you do something else, and then you say, well, we couldn't do this because you didn't dream dreams, or you didn't, expand your hope. Yeah, the purpose of a meeting of bishops to consider a pastoral question is to arrive at some suggestions to hand to the Pope about how you deal with the pastoral reality. Not to say we are in a process which is, equivalent to an encounter group enthusiasm moment in which everybody applauds someone who stands up and says, everything's new now, everything's different. No.
Yeah, and so I think ultimately, as I saw it, the problem with the synod on synodality is that it's encouraging sort of almost local churches or nationalist kind of churches to where we're kind of breaking into Protestantism, to where each church each nation, almost like the USCCB almost becomes our magisterium, and whatever version of that is in other countries. So, I don't know if that's how you see synodality leaning towards that, but that's how I see the problem. I say, wait a minute, we're becoming like Protestant churches.
Well, I don't see that is the main problem in the issue that the USCCB is going to act now, independently of Rome. I don't see that. What I see is that Rome is giving an indication that the church, as organized up till now, needs to be modified, that we need people who are not bishops exercising governing authority in the church. So this, unfortunately, it falls in a larger pattern of, sad to say, left-wing thought of the last 2 centuries, which is there's no truth in the world, there's only power. So we got to seize power so we can implement our agenda. And that's what we have here. It seems to me, the question is not, let's look at the church's evaluation of homosexuality. The question is, we're in charge here, now we approve of it, and we want you to go along with it. Wait a minute, where's that come from? These blessing of homosexual couples, they could not cite one scriptural, patristic, dogmatic statement from the church to justify this behavior. And they didn't even try. So in other words, the whole history of Christian doctrine and practice is just cast aside because Pope Francis says we need to bless homosexual couples. If this is what synodality means, then we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
And, this has nothing to do with Christianity.
So synodality in a way is almost the opposite of the deposit of faith. Fair enough?
It can be, and if it's used, having a synodality, according to what Vatican II meant, having a meeting of bishops with the Pope.
Advisory.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
If synodality means that you call a meeting at which, you can say in a joking fashion, Grandma Jones, who never studied theology, has an equal vote to the prefect for the doctrine of the faith in determining what we're going to tell the Pope, and then the Pope, is acting like, well, this is how we normally do things in the church. So what does that mean for the rest of the dioceses around the world? Do we have to have, lay people sitting on presbyteral councils, which is the advisory body in a diocese for a bishop, even though they're not priests, in the synodal church, lay people also get involved. It's contradicting the way we operate, because the way we operate is based on what the church was given by Christ.
Yeah.
Its very nature.
So you brought up Amoris Laetitia, or I mentioned it.
Yeah, Laetitia, yes.
But you brought it up because that was one of the first synods was on the family. And,
yes.
And that's where Amoris Laetitia, how do you say it? Laetitia.
Yeah.
And so we know the famous footnote that you threw a monkey wrench into a lot of things. Seemingly the moral theology on proper distribution of communion was called into question. Help us understand what he was doing. What happened? What's the result of that? Where is that? What was he really trying to say? Is it a doctrine of the church now? Like, what is all of that?
Well, the Pope said in the footnote that in some circumstances, communion can be given to those who are in irregular situations, couples in irregular situation, which is a euphemism for people in adulterous second marriages. And previous to that, in the body of the text, it says that God doesn't expect everyone to live up to the demands of the divine law. It doesn't use that exact language, but it's basically, some people cannot live up to the demands of the law, and therefore we have to make accommodations. Now, if we had more time, we go citations and all, but this is a conversation, so paraphrasing is okay.
Sure.
The whole problem here, of course, is, again, they can cite nothing in the church's law, teaching, moral theology, dogmatic statements, the Bible, or the fathers of the church to say that people who are living objectively in an adulterous relationship are not committing a sin. Therefore, they're qualified to receive communion. Because the church has always said adultery is a mortal sin. So if you're committing adultery or plan to commit adultery, you can't receive communion because you have an intention against your obligation as a Christian to live a virtuous life. So, this is bad. It was a big mistake. It was a mistake at the time. The priest, the cardinals who had problems with it wrote to the Pope and asked for clarification.
Cardinal Burke.
Cardinal Burke was one. He would not answer, which is pastorally deficient. He's the shepherd. When fellow shepherds come and say, the sheep are coming, saying, what does this mean? And we ourselves who are trained in theology, we don't think this is right. Can you explain to us how we reconcile this with previous doctrine? He wouldn't answer the question. So when you dodge a question, it means either that you don't take questions, or you're not confident you can answer them, their objections. So therefore you just avoid it. And, this is very bad. This is very bad. Amoris Laetitia needs to be withdrawn because it offends Catholic moral teaching.
Are you willing to say that it's a heretical footnote in a document?
Heretical in the sense, I wouldn't say it's heretical that it denies a dogma of the faith. I said it's an erroneous teaching because it teaches people that by implication, if you are in an adulterous relationship, you're not in a state of mortal sin, or you're not presumed to be in a state of mortal sin. The reason being that either you're not held to that law because God doesn't hold everybody to the law, which is an error, or it's no longer a mortal sin in certain particular circumstances. I mean, they use this nonsense logic that, and I think Cardinal Fernandez was the one saying, well, if they were to split up, it would be bad. It would be bad for them. It would. No, wait a minute. Or if they didn't engage in adulterous behavior, it would be a harm to them. No, it's always a harm to engage in adultery. So
yeah, and the footnote is not presupposing that these people are living in a Josephite marriage.
Or marriage with not involving sexual activity.
That is not the presumption.
No, that's not
if
the
it was, they would have said that.
No, they would, and that's what was said in previous documents by John Paul II, which, a couple who for serious reason are an invalid marriage but can't split up, either for the good of the children or caring for a sick spouse, then you live as brother and sister.
Yeah,
absolutely. We were taught that in the seminary.
Yeah, and that's
but that's not what Amoris Laetitia is about.
No, it's not. And that is an encyclical, right? It's an encyclical. Is it?
It's an apostolic exhortation, post-synodal apostolic exhortation.
Is there a difference between that and
it's a teaching instrument, it's a teaching document of the Pope. It's issued under his signature. He intended that what is written in it be accepted as his teaching.
Right. So how do you, on a relative basis to other things, what weight of authority do you give it?
It lacks authority it's impossible to authorize a practice which violates God's law. So you can say to people, Pope Francis thinks those living in adulterous situations are allowed to go to communion. Pope Francis is wrong. he was wrong when he stated it's still wrong. And then how do you say, just people say, well, how do you know that, Father Murray? You're smarter than Pope? No, I'm not claiming brilliance as the logic. I'm saying everything taught up to that time said the exact opposite.
Tan Books is here to help you become a saint. That's why we do everything we do. We publish thousands of titles, literally, that are specifically written to help you get to heaven. Everything from the lives of the saints to the writings of the saints, the greatest doctors of the church, the great spiritual masters, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Francis de Sales, and so on. So please come to tanbooks.com and find the book that God wants you to have right now so that you can get to heaven and be a saint for eternity.
This is a hard question. Do you know of other things in the history of the papacy where popes taught moral theology incorrectly? Now that's different than a pope misbehaving.
Right. No, I don't, to be honest, because
I don't either.
No, because
that's
moral
kind of the point. You know?
Moral teaching is consistent. Now, the heretical movements have always been around, and popes have condemned
There's
them.
been anti-popes and stuff, you know.
Yeah, and then, questioning Christian morality on a number of issues. But no pope has ever taught that homosexual couples are, number one, are couples, and they're blessable as such. And no pope has ever taught that people in an objective state of an adulterous relationship are qualified to receive Holy Communion while remaining in that relationship.
Yeah. So, it's an interesting thing that I was talking to a very good friend, Father Jeffrey Kirby, and a very educated guy. But, he just pointed out to me one day, he said, listen, there's been popes that have lived scandalously. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Sure.
And so, often when we're talking about Pope Francis, we'll say, oh, well, there's been a lot of bad popes. That's kind of something that people throw out there. But the point is that this is different. It's not a question of degree. If some pope in the Middle Ages was having an affair, like that's different. We're not talking about degree, and we're not talking about Pope Francis's sinful or virtuous life. It's a difference in kind, because we're talking about somebody who seemingly was trying to change moral teachings of the church on certain things, and we don't have a record of popes doing that previously. So I think this is a difference in kind, not degree, and I think it's important for people to realize that when they're trying to say, oh yeah, there were those medieval corrupt popes. It's different because they weren't trying to change doctrine.
Yeah, and when people say, well, Father Murray, what gives you the right to contradict the Pope? And the answer I'll say is, okay, did Pope Francis contradict Pope Benedict? And what right did he have to do that? In other words, the appeal to authority, the man in charge gets to do what he wants. The Catholic Church never taught that.
Yeah.
We don't.
Yeah.
Certain secular governments teach that because it's in the interest of a dictator or a king to not be questioned. But this is not. We talk about communion and fraternity. The Pope said we got to walk together. Well, walking together will involve conversations that occasionally involve contradictions. But the Pope didn't want to hear that.
Yeah.
He didn't want to answer Cardinal Burke and the other cardinals. That's not a synodal way of acting.
Right. And then actually a lot of actions were taken against them. They were removed from positions.
Yeah,
There was clear retribution.
It was not a just way of acting, in my opinion.
Do you have any indication or anything to say about how Pope Leo might handle the issue of Amoris Laetitia?
No. I'm waiting to hear.
Just nothing. Yeah,
don't know.
We have no idea.
Don't know.
What about, okay, so we talked about his encyclical or his apostolic letter.
Yes.
And the lack of weight that has. What about the death penalty in the Catechism? What do you do with that?
That's another mistake. The Catholic Church has never taught that the application of the death penalty per se, in and of itself, is immoral. Never taught that. In fact, it's the opposite. Because in the sacred scriptures in the Old Testament, God the Father commands the death penalty for certain offenses. Mm-hmm. How can God command something that's per se immoral? Therefore, it's not immoral. And so this is it. The natural law and revelation both support the fact that a man can be subject to certain penalties for crimes, and that certain grave crimes include the penalty of losing your life at the hands of a legitimate authority. So yes, it's
a problem.
It's a problem in the Catechism.
All right.
Absolutely.
So how does so that's a doctrinal issue.
Yes.
Canonically or procedurally, how does the Pope change the Catechism without the involvement of bishops? How does that happen?
The Catechism was issued by the Pope. The Catechism of the Catholic Church was not issued by the bishops. It was issued by the Pope. So in fact, it's been revised on a few issues over time, and it can certainly be revised again.
Okay. So did that mean, do you know, like when he says the Catechism's been changed, like we just heard that on the news one day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard that the bishops just heard it on the news one day because they weren't really
Maybe, I don't know if they
consulted.
were informed ahead of time, yeah.
So I know some weren't. I know that, but
sure.
because some of the bishops learned about it on CNN.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised.
So, but do you think that means that he had a Word document and he pulls up on his computer and he goes, the death penalty is now always wrong? And then the next time they go to press, it spits out differently.
No.
So like when a catechism's changed.
No, they issue a statement from the Holy See or a decree stating, paragraph X will now say this.
Okay. So they do like literally edit.
They change the words.
They edit the word.
Yep.
And the next press run that goes out, it has a new.
Well, now
the
press run, hopefully they update it on the website.
Right.
Which,
but if we bought a catechism in the last 12 months from somewhere, it should be, and it's updated, it should have that change
if it's printed after the change.
Right, which I haven't seen one. I'm just kind of curious.
I haven't either because the versions I have, were
they're old.
First came out.
The big green ones, or the big white ones, whatever.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious to actually see the new language. So anyway. All right. Do you think Leo will? Again, you probably have no idea because we just don't know enough about him. But I wonder if Leo will do anything about the death penalty because that was a change in doctrine. I thought.
Well, it's an attempt to change the doctrine.
Okay, but it's in the Catechism. So
no, I know, but it doesn't matter. If it was issued in another form, it's still an attempt. You can't change the nature of what's true. You can't say what the church taught as moral yesterday is now immoral. It doesn't work that way because then how do we trust anything the church teaches?
I know. So if you're teaching an RCA class, you tell these guys coming in that the Catechism of the Catholic Church is a statement of the ordinary magisterial teaching of the Church, and that there's two types of infallibility: one ex cathedra from the Pope, and one the ordinary magisterium of the Church.
Well,
so don't we end up with a problem?
Not everything in the ordinary magisterium is infallible. Taught infallibly, meaning without the possibility of error. But it is taught as to be true, and the infallibility adds a degree of certainty to it. Now that's a long discussion, and I'm not ready to basically give a class on it.
But I just thought the Catechism was a reliable source for finding what the ordinary teaching of the Church is.
Yeah, well, forgive my impatience. Yeah. The Pope attempted to change the teaching on the immorality of the morality of the death penalty. He can't do it. It's out of his power. Mm-hmm. He can put it in the book and say it's now. The word they use is inadmissible. Yeah,
inadmissible. Yeah,
which is not a moral. It's not a category of moral theology. Inadmissible is a comment on the ability to use something in a circumstance. Yeah. It's like evidence is inadmissible in a trial if it was gathered illegally.
Yeah,
that doesn't mean the evidence isn't true. It's just not admissible. What does it mean with regard to the use of the death penalty? It's not clear. Now, you read other things that Pope Francis said about the death penalty. We call it vengeance, and it's an offense against human dignity. Now, as soon as you say it's an offense against human dignity, you're putting in a category of sinful behavior.
Yeah.
Because the only thing that offends human dignity is something that offends God and His law. So
yeah. No, it's just frustrating.
Yeah,
it's frustrating because I've kind of had these clear buckets in my head, the Catechism is this thing and we can trust it and blah, blah, blah. And
you still trust it, but just a couple
not that provision.
No, but then with the proviso that things that have changed under Pope Francis on the death penalty are a mistake.
Yeah.
That's all.
Right.
Well, life is full of a lot of mistakes,
I'm aggravated. Okay.
Aggravation comes with being a human being.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's turn kind of our last segment here, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
You've written a lot over the last number of years about the McCarrick scandal and how the broader questions of accountability and abuse in the church. Why? Why that clearly? You wrote enough articles to where you think it's important.
Yeah.
So why do you think you?
Yeah, I wrote a few articles because the McCarrick situation displayed. crises in the church that we've experienced, the crisis of homosexual abuse by clergy, the crisis of cover-up of those acts by the hierarchy, and sad to say, the question of Pope Francis's knowledge of McCarrick's activity, and then his failure to do not only his failure to discipline him, but his using him as a part of his diplomatic outreach to China. Those are all involved in what's happened, because it's a long story for people not familiar with the McCarrick saga, but essentially, this is a man who, from an early age as a young priest, was committing immoral acts against victimizing young people, young boys, and then later seminarians, for immoral purposes. And, it turns out that people had reported him. He never suffered punishment until Pope Benedict put him under some penalties, but they were kept secret. I mean, Pope Benedict made a grave error. If McCarrick committed canonical offenses, they should have been handled in a canonical trial and then made public, and then his punishment should have been made public. Instead, he was told just, basically go under the radar, keep quiet. That nobody knew, therefore, that what McCarrick said was true. Or excuse me, that McCarrick had done evil acts, and that people who had accused him in the past were accurate. But the issue came forward when the Archdiocese of New York established a board for reconciling and compensating people who had been victimized by priests and others in the Archdiocese of New York. And an former seminarian who had never got ordained, but he was in the high school seminary, and he claimed that he was abused on 2 occasions by McCarrick when McCarrick was a priest of the Archdiocese of New York. And that complaint was raised to this reconciliation board, and then the investigation began. And then a year later, it was announced publicly that McCarrick, that these charges were likely to be true, and McCarrick was placed on restrictions. He denied the charges, he said, I have no recollection of any of this, which is, he was dodging. Yeah.
I don't believe I did this.
Yeah, I don't believe I did this.
It's like saying, I don't believe I robbed a bank,
it
20 years ago. I don't believe I committed murder 20 minutes. I mean, it's like, what are you talking about?
It was horrendous language. But then subsequent to all of that becoming public, then a man came forward named James Grine, who had been the son of one of McCarrick's friends, or the nephew, I forget the exact relation, but someone that McCarrick was friendly with that family, and he claimed with evidence that McCarrick had abused him, and multiple times over many years, sexual abuse. So at that point, then the Vatican acted more firmly. McCarrick resigned from the College of Cardinals, and then an investigation began, and he was removed from the priesthood. And then later on, the Vatican issued a report to describe what was called institutional knowledge of Cardinal McCarrick's activities, but the report itself was very flawed. One of the accusations against McCarrick was that he used money that he raised as to get by influence in Rome. And the report said, we are not going to examine accusations of related to the use of money and things of this sort. You see, what investigative body in the world would do that?
Would not follow the money.
Well, and the idea, since the accusations related to his behavior and trying to buy protection, of course, why wouldn't you investigate it?
That's crazy.
Well, because it was going to reveal, who he gave money to.
Who got the money.
And then, how he got this money and the misuse of it. So,
was Cardinal Pell involved in that investigation?
No,
with the money?
Not that I know of.
That was different. Okay.
Not that I know of. The report was produced by an American lawyer who was hired by the Vatican, and it took him over a year, maybe a year and a half, to produce it. And I read it cover to cover. A lot of information revealed. It's a very sobering report, but it also has a lot of holes in it. Mm-hmm. And they never interviewed Archbishop Vigano, even though he was the one who had brought the Pope's attention when the Pope asked him, about McCarrick's. So Vigano had knowledge. He should have been interviewed. Cardinal Sodano was Secretary of State for a large part of this time. He was never interviewed. So it was a flawed instrument.
So is it safe to say, even though Pope Benedict made some mistakes, that he made a lot of headway in cleaning up some of the abuse, but then, let's start with it. Did he make headway in dealing with this abuse crisis throughout the church?
He did. He handled those cases when he was the prefect of the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith. And then during his pontificate, he took some decisive action. He took action against Maciel, Father Marcial Maciel, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, who was horrendous actor. Did terrible things, fathered children with 2 different women, abused seminarians. So he took action against him. I don't think it was sufficient. He didn't throw him out of the priesthood because he was an older priest, but I think he should have. But he did. He changed some of the laws in the church, made it easier to prosecute some people. So,
and did we backslide on in the Francis papacy on this issue, or how did he handle the ongoing issue that Benedict kind of started to handle well?
Well, he did some good things. He wrote a document called Vos Estis, which is about not only the church prosecuting priests and others who commit sex crimes, but also bishops and other superiors who cover up for those people. Mm-hmm. So now the enforcement of Vos Estis has been spotty, and it has never functioned as I think it should have. But during the pontificate, we had, first of all, Vigano, told Pope Francis about McCarrick's misbehavior, and Pope Francis took no interest in pursuing that. We've had the case of Bishop Zanchetta in Argentina. He was a priest that Archbishop Bergoglio of Buenos Aires, he was like a protege of him. He was the secretary of the bishops' conference, and one of the first bishop that Pope Francis made when he was elected Pope was this Bishop Zanchetta, who was then, turns out he was a sexual abuser of seminarians, and he was caught, just disgusting behavior. He filmed himself naked committing impure acts, and it was on his phone, and he stupidly gave his phone, from his point of view stupidly, but he gave his phone to his media assistant to try and get some other pictures out of it, and he found these immoral pictures. And then he claimed he was hacked. The Pope took an interest. He protected him. Then he was prosecuted civil law because of his sexual abuse of seminarians. He was found guilty. But before that conviction, he had been given a job in the Vatican and protected. They claimed there was a canonical process against Zanchetta. It never came to any conclusion that we know of. And Zanchetta got out of prison and was allowed to do house arrest, even though, he was capable of staying in prison. So I think there was some favoritism given there. Then we have the Rupnik case. Father Rupnik was sexual abuse of nuns, and he was protected. The Pope said, his crimes were beyond the statute of limitations, and the Pope said, we lift the statute of limitation in case of minors, but other with adults, no. The media pressure continued, and then the victims came forward, and they got lawyers, and they did public statements. Then the Pope changed his mind, Pope Francis, and said, okay, we will have a canonical prosecution. But, when the Pope died, it had been over a year since that statute of limitations had been lifted. There was plenty of evidence because there were previous investigations of Zanchetta. He could have been convicted in a matter of 2 months in an orderly, proper judicial process. He wasn't. He's still a priest in good standing. He's incarnated in a diocese in his home country of Slovenia. So, no, the shadow of these cases, other cases happen, canonical record where priests who had been removed from the priesthood were allowed back in. What's going on here? There was a whole series of people who were given protection who don't deserve it and should have been, prosecuted and punished.
Pope Leo still has a mess to handle then.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think this factors into his papacy? And, if he's sitting down, the day after being made Pope, writing down the top 10 issues that he's going to have to deal with as Pope, which is what I would do if I was made the leader of any organization. does this make the list?
Oh, this has got to be high on the list.
Yeah.
The canonical justice system has to have the same professionalism and transparency as any modern Western judicial system has. So in other words, the rules have to be in place. They have to be applied. Prosecution should not be depending on whether you're a favorite or not of the people in charge. Everybody's equal under the law. Zanchetta, the case is under Cardinal Fernandez. And he was quoted in one interview saying, we're having difficulty finding judges to hear the case. This is absurd.
It's absurd.
It's an absurdity. There are plenty of canon lawyers you could appoint, and you're the delegate of the Pope. You submit to the Pope that these are 3 canon lawyers who could be the judicial panel to hear this case. Please appoint them. That's all.
Yeah.
So, so it's a year and a half out after they announced that they would prosecute him. It's still, no trial has happened. Very, very, discouraging. And the victims, where's the pastoral solicitude to the victims?
Yes.
Zanchetta, if people are indicted for sex crimes, you don't allow them to float around. You imprison them if there's, sufficient evidence for a judge to do that. You put them in jail. And in the case of a Catholic priest, you put him under restrictions. We know of no restrictions on Zanchetta.
Yeah, that's a scandal.
Yeah, it's a scandal.
It's a scandal.
It's a scandal.
All right, we've talked about some tough stuff. What's your hope for for this papacy and for the future of the church?
No, my hope is that God is good. His grace is manifold. It's ever present. We have a pope who is a man who's exercised authority in the church up to this point in subordinate roles. So he's used to being, involved in governing in the life of the church. So now he has an opportunity to do that as the Roman pontiff. He's certainly educated. He knows canon law. He has, experience in dealing with bishops. So I think we have a possibility here for a pope who will respond to the ordinary expressions of people, the cardinals, the bishops, what they want to be done. The idea that 5 cardinals would issue, formal questions, said the dubious, and that you never answer them. That's not how you claim to be a church in which everyone's concerned for everyone. That's not how you run that kind of church. I think Pope Leo will be much better in that regard. So it'll be very good if cardinals now say, well, now we have a series of questions, things we've discussed here, Amoris Laetitia, Fiducia Supplicans, death penalty. Doubts are expressed about the nature and validity of these teachings and practices. Could we please get some clarity? And I think that Pope Leo will be much more inclined to do so.
I think so too. I think we all need to remain hopeful. And it's my understanding that, when he was going through that election process, the more Orthodox cardinals got together with him and said, you have to protect the more traditional Catholics. You have to bring unity that way. Mm-hmm. And so I think that he probably feels the pressure. He might be inclined to do that himself, but at the very least, I think he's going to bring order and structure to this. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic and hopeful. So as we wrap up, everyone always hears you or reads you and hears you on TV and very serious matters. I mean, you kind of deal with weighty things all the time. You know what I mean? That's kind of like, and you got the right gravitas for it. I mean, you do. I mean, it just kind of, it fits you, But I want to know a little bit more about you just personally as like a guy, right? So rapid fire questions, okay?
They better be good ones.
You didn't know this was coming. But I just want to know who like the guy is,
Yes.
So your favorite movie?
Favorite movie is Breaker Morant.
Never seen. What is that?
Okay, I'm here to educate you, my friend.
Right.
Breaker Morant is a story of Australian soldiers who fought with the British Army in the Boer War in South Africa, and their punishment for killing prisoners was disproportionate to what was done with others who had did similar crimes. So it's kind of a morality thing. It's based on actual historical things. It's well acted. was part of that wave of Australian movies in the 70s and 80s. So Breaker Morant, go watch it.
I'm going to.
Yeah, you're going to like it.
I'm going to do it.
Call me up after you watch it.
I will. Favorite book? You can't say the Bible.
Favorite book? Very good question. If I was a kid, I'd say, Jules Verne or something like that. But my favorite book, one of the most important books I ever read in my life was Witness by Whittaker Chambers.
Okay, I haven't read that.
Yeah, well, he was a communist spy. He was an American who worked for the Russians and then left the Soviet spy system and then revealed the extent of Soviet penetration in the American government in the 30s and 40s. And he wrote a biography, which is a towering book. It's probably the best autobiography written by an American in the 20th century.
And the name again?
Witness. Whittaker Chambers.
Yeah, Whittaker Chambers. All right. Favorite book of the Bible?
Favorite book of the Bible? I'm going to have to say Gospel of St. John.
Can't beat it.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yep.
I'd say Song of Songs, but that's Old Testament. Maybe you can break it into 2 books.
Old Testament is good stuff too, of course, absolutely.
All right, but in a line, why St. John?
Well, the divinity of Christ is taught so clearly. The high priestly prayer is such a beautiful thing that was recorded by St. John. The beginning of in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. I mean, this is a beautiful revelation of the incarnation, the eternal existence of the second person of the Trinity. So, Gospel of St. John.
The high priestly prayer.
Yes.
Is that when he says, like the Father gave me his name? And what's that phrase?
Yeah, that's in there, and we just had that in the Gospel today in a daily Mass.
Yes, exactly. It's funny.
Everything the Father has, he's given to me, etc. Yes.
Yeah, and this is crazy. You mentioned the high priestly prayer because our mutual friend Frank Trotta, I got his email this morning, and he said, "What do you think this passage means about the Father gave me his name?" And it's I can't quote it exactly, but it's a little it's a little different. You have to take some thinking to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a revelation of the the one Godhead.
The one Godhead. Yeah. All right, moving on. That was supposed to be rapid.
That's okay.
I'm dragging it.
That's all right.
Favorite sport?
Well,
You're in New York.
No, my favorite sport is ice hockey.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really? I thought you were going to say baseball.
But I would say favorite sport to play is ice hockey. Favorite sport to watch is baseball.
Really?
Because I used to play hockey, and I played adult hockey for 10 years.
Did you really?
In New York.
Well, you're a big dude. People don't realize that, but
you're just under 6'2" approximately. Put me on skates, add a couple of inches.
Yeah.
No, I love ice skating. When I was a kid, my grandmother bought me the hockey equipment, and I used to skate on the lakes up in Westchester County where I grew up. And then I played men's adult hockey for 10 years. I loved it. So
wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's awesome. All right, Yankees or Mets?
Yankees.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. So.
If you go on your dream vacation, what do you do and where?
Dream vacation. Well, I like the seaside. I grew up as a kid going to Neponset and the Rockaways in Brooklyn. So I like the ocean. I like the salt air. I like biking. I used to run, but I gave that up. But I do biking, and I like to play golf. So,
nice.
A lot of golf courses on the East Coast. So.
Yeah. Most importantly, your favorite podcast. The Conor Gallagher Show.
It just so happens that I now have a favorite podcast.
All right. God bless you, Father.
Thank you, Conor.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
You're a treasure for this church.
Pray for me.
A voice of clarity in crazy times, and we will pray for you, and you pray for us in 10 books. So,
amen.
Thank you, Father.
You got it.
All right, let's go get some dinner.
Amen.
All right. Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.